At 9 a.m. on Monday, October 31st, 2002, the owner of the trading company, Steve Canavan, opened the door of the warehouse located in the small town of Huyton, near Liverpool, United Kingdom, intending to start the work week. However, upon entering the warehouse, he immediately noticed bloody shoe prints. Following the tracks into a utility room, he discovered the body of a man on the floor. Steve realized there was nothing he could do to help. Blood was everywhere, and the deceased's face was disfigured beyond recognition. Officers called by Steve noticed a large gunshot hole in the warehouse ceiling. Comparing this with the appearance of the deceased and the mark on the back of his head, they concluded that he had been shot in the face with a shotgun. The head injury was so severe that identification was impossible. However, documents in the victim's pockets revealed the name Gerald or Jed Gilbert. Company owner Steve Canavan explained that 46-year-old Jed worked for him as a sales manager. He was his best employee, a talented salesman who would be irreplaceable. Jed's abilities allowed him to earn well and buy a wonderful Victorian-style house. Success, however, did not go to his head. He was a very pleasant, kind, and of course, sociable person, which was natural for such a job. Steve had no idea why someone would shoot Jed. However, there was a safe on the premises, embedded in the floor. The mat covering the safe was shifted, but it did not seem like someone was looking for keys or attempting to break in. Did Jed come to work during a robbery? An inventory of all items in the warehouse was needed to ensure nothing was missing. However, a more careful examination of the crime scene suggested another scenario. There were no signs of a break-in or forced entry into the warehouse. And when the forensic expert moved the body, 2 bloodied latex fragments were found underneath, likely from a glove. It seemed the killer was trying to create the appearance of a robbery to hide the fact that he came here with the sole purpose of killing Jed Gilbert. Jed arrived at work where the perpetrator lay in wait. When the man opened the door, the killer entered behind him. But why would someone want to kill an ordinary sales manager? Detectives decided to ask this question to his ex-wife, who had just arrived at the crime scene. Jed Gilbert and Ann Huxley met at a nightclub when he was 41 and she was 32. At first glance, they had nothing in common. Ann was born and raised in Kensington, not a very prestigious area of Liverpool where working-class people reside. She had been divorced twice and was raising a daughter and a son. Jed, on the other hand, lived a lavish lifestyle and had never been tied down by marriage. However, they shared an entrepreneurial spirit, both willing to work hard to secure a better life for themselves. Ann managed a network of small businesses, including coffee shops popular among the police, who enjoyed stopping by for a cup of coffee. Ann and Jed immediately liked each other and started dating. The man's family, his sister and mother, didn't approve of the girl, but the lovers paid no attention to it. A year later, Ann moved in with Jed, and in 1998 they got married. Unfortunately, in 2002, after just 4 years of marriage, they divorced. But they continued to live in the same house, under the same roof, just in different rooms. Apparently, their feelings had not cooled, and after some time, the former spouses reconciled and even wanted to remarry. But the day before, on Sunday, the man urgently left for work because he needed to resolve an issue with urgent delivery or something similar and did not return home. After Ann called all relatives, friends, and neighbors all night, she came to his workplace in the morning. Ann went into hysterics upon hearing that Jed had been killed. When she calmed down a bit, the detectives asked if she knew the reason someone might want to harm Jed. They were sure she would say no, but to their surprise, Ann answered yes. Jed was into gambling, a regular at the casino, but unfortunately he was not a very lucky player. He had accumulated debts, and Ann feared that it would end with them losing their home. That's why, she claimed, she divorced him so that he couldn't dispose of it on his own. However, her husband still found a way to get the money. He embezzled £11,000 from the company he worked for. This meant that the police needed to have a more serious conversation with his boss, Steve Canavan. But that wasn't all. Ann revealed that after the divorce, she was seeing a man named Paul Gunning. Her new boyfriend didn't like that she and her ex-husband were still living under the same roof. Eventually, Ann got fed up, broke up with the man, but he wouldn't let go. In the end, she had to take extreme measures. She asked a friend to intimidate Paul Gunning to make him leave her alone. Thanks to Ann, the investigation gained a whole new set of leads. Perhaps Jed owed a significant amount of money to dangerous people, or was there a conflict with the employer due to embezzlement from the company? Finally, Could it be a jealous lover deciding to eliminate a rival? While the police were exploring the most likely scenarios, the autopsy report arrived. The forensic expert determined the cause of Jed Gilbert's death, and it turned out to be completely different from what the detectives had expected. Although someone had clearly fired into the ceiling, there were no signs that the man had been shot. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, and the brutality and force of the beating were simply unimaginable. Every bone in the victim's skull was broken, and there was a hole above the left eyebrow. The blows were clearly not inflicted with the butt of a shotgun, and when the police completed an inventory of what was in the warehouse, they found that only a fire extinguisher was missing. So the killer beat the man with a fire extinguisher and took him away from the crime scene. But who could display such cruelty? Jed's ex-wife believed that due to his gambling addiction, he had earned many dangerous enemies. The police investigated the casinos he frequented but couldn't find any significant leads. They failed to establish a connection with casino owners or debt collectors. Moreover, wouldn't Jed be more valuable alive if they wanted him to repay his debts? On the other hand, there was the man's boss, Steve Canavan, from whom Jed had stolen £11,000. However, the police faced another setback here. Steve denied that he would kill an employee over £11,000, especially an employee who brought him much larger profits. Steve even admitted that Jed was irreplaceable. Therefore, he simply demanded the stolen amount back and deducted the money from his salary. At the time of the murder, Jed had returned £5,000. Finally, Steve had a confirmed alibi, and detectives had to acknowledge that nothing pointed to the man's involvement. There was one more potential suspect mentioned by Anne Huxley, her ex-boyfriend, Paul Gunning. Anne thought it was possible that Paul Gunning might have wanted to get rid of Jed to take his place. However, during the conversation with the detectives, Paul vehemently denied any involvement in the case. He spoke openly and directly to the police. Yes, he had a romance with Anne, but it remained in the past, and he had no grievances against her ex-husband. He also had a solid alibi for the time of Jed Gilbert's death. While detectives couldn't find anything linking Paul Gunning to Jed's murder, the man provided them with a very unexpected piece of information. He used to own an escort agency, and a few years ago, Anne Huxley came to work for him. Apparently, she was not devoid of entrepreneurial spirit, as she quickly not only bought the agency from him, but also opened 4 more. The network of stores and coffee shops, including the one frequented by police officers, was just a successful cover for Anne's expanding business, and it was far from the business she claimed to be involved in when talking to the police. It's not entirely clear what prompted the detectives to also speak with Anne's friend, whom she asked to intimidate Paul Gunning. However, after talking to him, they encountered a big surprise. The man, also named Paul Huyton, worked as a bouncer in a nightclub in Birkenhead near Liverpool, where Anne was looking for a place for her next escort agency. They met and became friends there, but according to the 40-year-old man, they were not just friends. Anne was his fiancée. The man admitted that he was in love with Anne, and during a trip to South Africa, he proposed to her, and they got engaged. In other words, it might not have been Paul Gunning, but Paul Huyton who could be jealous of Anne's ex-husband, with whom she lived under the same roof. However, the man replied that he had no reason to be jealous because Anne accepted his proposal, as if that explained everything. Detectives asked him about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, and that's when Paul Huyton started talking nonsense. He claimed that his mother fell ill. He became upset, and seeking support, he called a friend, another Paul Lewis. They got into a car to go to Wales, but on the way, the car started making strange noises, and they had to turn back. They went to a bar, had some drinks, and when they left the bar, the car wouldn't start at all. Investigators verified the alibi with his friend, 36-year-old Paul Lewis, also a bouncer at the bar, who confirmed his friend's words. Although there was nothing particularly fantastic in this version of events, investigators did not believe it. And what also bothered them was that if Anne could easily lie to the police about her fiancé, what else was she willing to lie about? In other words, she immediately classified her ex-boyfriend as a potential suspect, but strangely forgot to mention the man she was planning to marry. Furthermore, according to Anne, she and her husband had reconciled and were planning to remarry, and she referred to Paul Huyton as a friend who had done her a favor. So what was really going on? After examining every detail of Anne's testimony, investigators confirmed that on that fateful day, she spent time with her family, making several calls to Jed's relatives and friends, expressing concern for him. She even called her fiancé, precisely at the time when, according to his account, they were heading to Wales with a friend. However, the ping from his phone showed that he was actually in the vicinity of the crime scene. Suspicions about Paul Huyton's involvement grew, but what role did his fiancé play in all of this? According to Anne, in early 2002, her husband's gaming addiction forced her to divorce him to avoid losing their house, but they tried to mend their relationship. However, when investigators spoke to the man's relatives, they painted a completely different picture. The man's addiction didn't scare Anne. It infuriated her, so there was no talk of reconciliation. She filed for divorce because she was disgusted by her husband and she had had enough of him. Anne didn't leave the house because he paid for the roof over her head, but treated him like a doormat. After the divorce, they slept in separate rooms. And Anne occasionally brought other men home. This seemingly tormenting situation for Jed lasted for months until everything suddenly changed. One of Jed's friends told the police that in the summer of 2002, he had dinner with the former spouses and couldn't believe the positive changes in their relationship. They appeared to be a happy couple again. Anne affectionately embraced Jed and assured everyone that they were planning to remarry. Completely perplexed, investigators couldn't understand why Paul Huyton believed they were engaged when Anne was planning to marry her ex-husband again. Everything fell into place after examining the finances of the former spouses. One August day, Anne walked into an insurance office and took out a £400,000 life insurance policy on both of them. In the event of the sudden death of one of the ex-spouses, the surviving one would receive £400,000. She then went to a lawyer with a will in which Jed left everything to her. 6 weeks later, he was killed. Anne Huxley increasingly appeared as a black widow who lured her ex-husband into a deadly trap to collect the insurance payout in the house. Meanwhile, evidence against Paul Huyton and Paul Lewis was accumulating like a snowball. The owner of the nightclub in Birkenhead, where both men worked as bouncers, revealed that on the night Jed was killed, the men came to the club carrying a fire extinguisher. Perhaps they thought no one would pay attention to two bouncers with a fire extinguisher. The adjacent building to the club belonged to a hot-dip galvanizing workshop, which housed acid containers. The police contacted the workshop and requested the containers to be drained. There, they found the fire extinguisher. It was damaged but not destroyed. Immediately after this, the results came in from examining the latex scraps found under Jed's body. They were indeed pieces of a glove with Paul Lewis's DNA. It was minimal, but enough to prove that Paul Lewis was at the crime scene, wearing gloves, and must have been involved in the murder. So, after 2 months of investigation, the police had gathered enough evidence against Paul Huyton and Paul Lewis. However, detectives were convinced that Anne also played a role in her ex-husband's murder. She had already persuaded Paul Huyton to attack her boyfriend. What would stop her from orchestrating another assault, only this time to get rid of her husband and claim his property and insurance? The challenge remained in proving it because all the evidence collected so far was circumstantial. On December 16, 2002, 6 weeks after Jed's murder, Paul Huyton and Paul Lewis were arrested and brought in for questioning. Paul Huyton didn't resist for long and admitted that he was at the warehouse, but claimed he went there supposedly to warn Jed to stay away from his fiancée. However, Jed reacted aggressively, suddenly pulled out a shotgun and pointed it at Paul. With no other option, Paul had to defend himself. The men struggled. A shot was fired and the bullet hit the ceiling. Then, Paul Huyton reached for the fire extinguisher hanging on the wall and struck his opponent with it. After the commotion, his friend rushed in. Paul Lewis confirmed that he was waiting in the car outside when he heard a loud noise and ran inside. There, he saw the victim on the floor, and Paul Huyton beating him with the fire extinguisher. It was not entirely self-defense, since Paul Huyton came to the warehouse on his own, but he presented the situation as if it was a quarrel and claimed no guilt in the murder. However, this story did not explain why Paul Lewis ran to the warehouse in latex gloves and how they ended up torn under the victim's body. Both men also remained silent about Anne. Therefore, when she appeared at the police station the next day, she confidently told the same story as before. She claimed to be mourning her husband, and there was no reason to suspect her of the murder. Supposedly, Paul Huyton was so infatuated with her that he decided to commit murder, and she knew nothing about it. As for the insurance and the will, these documents were arranged in the interests of her children. If anything were to happen to her, they would be financially protected. The police had nothing to counter her argument. Fortunately, as it often happens, the killer cannot keep their crime a secret. A witness, to whom Paul Huyton confessed everything, came forward to the police. In reality, he entered the warehouse with a shotgun, intending to shoot Jed. However, at the last minute, he couldn't bring himself to commit the crime. Paul Huyton was a strong man, a bouncer at the club, but not a criminal, and he lacked the courage to kill someone face to face. Jed seized the weapon, and a struggle ensued. It's unclear how it would have ended, but Paul Lewis came to his friend's aid. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and began beating Jed. At some point, Paul Huyton might have taken control, although detectives believe that Paul Lewis was responsible for all the fatal blows to Jed. Leaving the lifeless man on the floor, the accomplices left. The witness stated that the accomplices did it for money and promised the men £100,000 collectively for committing the crime. The witness's testimony not only provided the police with enough evidence to charge Paul Huyton and Paul Lewis, but also confirmed the police's suspicions that the mastermind behind it all was the Black Widow, Anne Haxley. As if that wasn't enough, another witness came forward, providing testimony against the accomplices. On that fateful evening, he agreed to give his friends a ride to the warehouse, thinking they needed to repossess a car due to unpaid debts. There was a van near the warehouse, and the witness assumed that the men would take it. This didn't surprise him at all, as they had previously performed similar tasks for insurance companies. According to his account, Paul Huyton and Paul Lewis asked him to park nearby and simply wait for a call. Interestingly, he parked right next to a mobile phone tower. After 20 minutes, they called and asked to pick them up. Only when they got into the car did the man realize that he had allowed himself to get involved in something unpleasant. The men were discussing an attack on someone, and he noticed blood on one of their shoes. There was enough evidence and witness testimony to charge both men with the murder of Jed and Anne with conspiracy to commit murder. The only thing the police didn't find was the shotgun the men disposed of. The trials began in April 2004. Since Paul Huyton was accused of delivering the fatal blows, he appeared before the judge first. Surprisingly, he shocked everyone by confessing to the murder. In England and Wales, this automatically leads to a life sentence. His decision sparked many debates and speculations. Some believed he got in too deep and would have been convicted anyway. Others thought he couldn't bear Anne's suffering and was trying to protect her. Unfortunately, she didn't reciprocate when it was her turn to testify. She happily confirmed that Paul Huyton took matters into his own hands out of jealousy because she and Jed had reconciled. Anne tried to portray herself as a modest housewife, but her efforts were unsuccessful. The prosecution effectively portrayed Anne as a Black Widow. Angry over her husband's gambling debts, she divorced him only to devise a deadly plan to enrich herself at his expense. She was willing to stop at nothing to get the house and £400,000. When Paul Lewis gave his testimony, he also tried to shift the blame onto Paul Huyton, despite the evidence suggesting otherwise. In the end, all three were found guilty. The men were sentenced to life imprisonment, and Anne received a 20-year prison term. The men were given the opportunity to apply for parole in 2020, but their release was denied. From the very beginning, the murder of Jed Gilbert, a 46-year-old sales manager, resembled the script of a Hollywood movie more than an ordinary criminal case. Relentlessly following the trail of evidence, detectives ventured into the realm of gambling, love triangles, escort agencies, and finally apprehended murderers driven by the desire for quick gain. Passion, greed, jealousy, betrayal, the list could go on indefinitely. This case had it all. Carrie Swenson probably learned to ski before she could walk, but she could never have imagined that biathlon would become her life because for women, this sport simply didn't exist before. Finally, in 1983, women were allowed to compete in biathlon, despite many of them enduring years of rigorous training. The USA team missed the first Women's European Cup but participated in the first Women's World Championship in Chamonix, France. The 22-year-old American, Carrie Swenson, started with the traditional 10 kilometers race. She finished fifth right after the Soviet athletes who were considered unbeatable leaders in the sport. In the 5 kilometers sprint, she was the best among her teammates, securing the 13th position. However, the real triumph for the team and personally for Carrie came in the relay. The Americans took the 3rd place, and Carrie and her teammates became the first medalists from the USA. After the biathlon season ended, Carrie returned home to Montana, where she planned her perfect summer. She got a job at a popular tourist ranch called Lone Mountain Ranch and spent all her free time trail running in the backcountry. Carrie opened the window, letting the fresh night air fill her bedroom. This morning, she graduated from Montana State University, receiving her degree in microbiology. After the ceremony, her parents threw a party, celebrating both her graduation and her brother Paul's 21st birthday. They had only won last summer at the Lone Mountain Ranch in the Big Sky area to practice and enjoy the mountains as they did in their childhood. One more year of competitions, and then she would leave to study veterinary medicine, a dream she had since she was 5 years old. Carrie turned off the light in her room and happily drifted into sleep, unaware that her dreams would soon be shattered by the selfish plans of two recluses. Carrie had no idea about the conversation between the two men that took place in the mountains, several kilometers away from her. The younger man didn't hide his irritation. He generally enjoyed living away from people and their rules, but he felt lonely in the mountains and longed for female company. "Dad, do you remember the plans we discussed about getting ourselves a woman?" The father looked carefully at his 18-year-old son and asked, "Do you think the time has come?" In response, the son nodded confidently. On Sunday, July 15th, Carrie went for a run around Elray's Lake. She chose this route because Bob Sharp, the owner of the snack bar where she worked, had told her that he had seen a grizzly bear in the area, and she was eager to see it herself. As usual, Carrie ran fairly quickly, focusing on her breathing. Only at the last moment did she notice two men ahead of her. The strangers looked unkempt, they were not smiling, and the younger one had his hands on a pistol and a knife. Rifles were lying near a tree, even though the hunting season had long ended. Without taking their eyes off her, the men made Carrie realize that they had no good intentions. Unfortunately, she noticed them too late to turn around and run back. Fear triggered an adrenaline rush in her blood, and Carrie sprinted forward even faster, trying to pass the strangers as quickly as possible. However, her plan failed. The older man jumped right in front of her on the trail and grabbed her wrist. Not giving her a chance to react, he grabbed her other hand. Unable to break free from their grip, Carrie decided to rely on her wits and remain calm. The wild look in the older man's eyes frightened her. "Stay calm, don't provoke them," she thought. "Please, let me go," she said. "No, we don't come across pretty girls like you very often. We want to talk to you. What's your name?" he asked, holding Carrie even tighter. He began asking her various questions about whether she was married, who she lived with, and so on. Realizing that she wouldn't be released easily, Carrie tried to scream, but the man quickly silenced her. The stranger released her left hand, only to strike her in the face and then tie her up with a rope. The men said they would keep her with them for 4 or 5 days, and if she didn't like life in the mountains, they would let her go. However, from their smirks, she understood that they were more likely to take advantage of her vulnerability and eventually kill her. "It's just a nightmare," she repeated to herself, hoping to wake up at any moment, but the pulsating pain in her wrist and face indicated that it wasn't a dream. Carrie tried to appeal to their reason, explaining that her family and friends would look for her. In response, the older man threatened to shoot anyone who tried to rescue her. The men hurried on, wanting to move farther away from the lake and into the forest where they wouldn't be noticed. Carrie had no choice but to allow them to drag her along on the rope. Pretending to be submissive, she discreetly memorized the surrounding area to ensure she wouldn't run in the wrong direction when she got a chance to escape. The men walked side by side, chatting casually, as if kidnapping girls was an everyday occurrence for them. They discussed their views on society, laws, and the mountains. The older man expressed dissatisfaction with the region's development, particularly the fact that farmers were allowed to graze their livestock on his land. He told the younger man that he could learn everything necessary for life without returning to formal education or obeying society's laws. Such conversations made Carrie realize that her captors were likely mentally unstable. In an attempt to slow down their movement, Carrie asked for water and claimed she needed to rest. The men agreed to take a break. They approached a swamp, and to her horror, Carrie watched as the older man began drinking water from it. She tried to warn him about the dangerous bacteria present in the swamp, but he dismissed her concerns, saying it was the first time he'd heard of it. Reluctantly, she took a few sips as well. She noticed that the kidnappers behaved less aggressively when she pretended not to fear them. Carrie started cautiously questioning them about how long they've been living here without knowing about the dangers of drinking water from the local swamp. They replied that they were relatively new to the area but had been living in the mountains for 12 years. The younger man added with a smirk that they were desperately in need of female company, making Carrie feel even more uncomfortable. Afterward, they continued on their way. Carrie tried to step on soft ground and break twigs to leave clues for her family and friends who would search for her. Unfortunately, the older man noticed her efforts and thwarted them. Nevertheless, since she had nothing to lose, Carrie stubbornly kept leaving marks, and the older man kept erasing them. They continued this way, and when Carrie checked her watch, she realized that no one had started looking for her yet. It was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Meanwhile, Carrie's friend and colleague, Alan Goldstein, who taught shooting to guests at the ranch, began to wonder why her run was taking so long. He was afraid that she might have encountered a bear or twisted her ankle and couldn't make it back home on her own. Meanwhile, the strangers continued to lead Carrie further and further away from the ranch. After discussing how far they needed to go, they asked her if she could walk 60 kilometers in a day. She chose not to answer, revealing her capability of running 50 kilometers in hilly terrain during training to her captors was out of the question. If they thought she was weaker than she really was, they might move at a slower pace. She had no doubt now that they wouldn't let her live. Not now, not in 4 or 5 days. They wouldn't sacrifice their precious freedom for her. Carrie continued to subtly study the men. They not only shared a common philosophy but also bore a striking resemblance to each other. She started suspecting they were father and son. Carrie knew that people would soon start looking for her, but the thought of her parents or friends falling victim to her captors was far more terrifying than anything she had experienced so far. One way to avoid this was to escape. Since pleading didn't work, she decided to change tactics. Her tennis coach used to say, "Change your tactics when you're losing." Why continue playing a losing game when you have the opportunity to change your strategy? Around 5 p.m., the men decided to take a break for the night, but not before chaining her to a tree, severely limiting her chances of a possible escape. Mosquitoes and black flies were having a feast, with Carrie as their main dish. She was exhausted, hungry, thirsty, fearful for her life, and now chained. Near the tree, she noticed several rocks, one of which could be used to break a link in the chain at night. It was time to try the new strategy. Carrie decided to become unbearable. "Hey, I'm tired of standing by the tree. Loosen the chain so I can sit down," she demanded. The men looked bewildered but allowed her to sit. With her eyes closed as if resting, she secretly tried to reach for the rock. Unfortunately, the younger man noticed her attempt and removed all the rocks she could reach. Around 8 p.m., she continued to act obnoxious and demanded feminine items as she was freezing and being driven mad by the mosquitoes. The younger man, whom the older one called Dan, gave her a shirt and socks, and the older man started talking about how they had many of his ex-wife's things in the underground caves where they live. He went on about how cozy those caves were and that they would never be found there. Carrie heard a voice in the distance. Unfortunately, her captors heard it too. Simultaneously, a plane appeared in the sky. Carrie didn't know if the plane was searching for her, but the men got alarmed and quickly extinguished the campfire. They clearly didn't expect someone to search for the captive so soon. After circling the forest for about an hour, the plane flew away. With dread, Carrie awaited the upcoming night and what they would do to her. However, they left her to herself while sitting silently by the smoldering fire. As night fell, they provided her with one sleeping bag, while they lay in another. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, the concern of Carrie's colleagues grew. 2 hours after she was supposed to show up for work, they started searching for her. Friends and family members of Carrie divided into 4 teams, each tasked with combing through their assigned areas. Carrie's father, Swenson, got in touch with a friend who was a pilot to ask for help flying over the forest. Sharp informed him about the possibility of Carrie encountering a grizzly bear on that trail, which filled him with dread. The teams searched for several hours, calling out her name as they combed the areas where Carrie was likely to run, but as darkness fell, they had to suspend the search. Carrie's brother, Paul, found their father at the ranch after he returned from the airstrip. His father looked pale and restless with worry. Paul needed some time alone, so he asked his father to let him know as soon as there was any news about Carrie and went to his room. He quickly took a shower and lay down on his bed. Suddenly, he saw Carrie. She was tied to a log like some kind of captive animal. The men were sitting around a campfire nearby. His sister was crying. Paul woke up from this horrifying nightmare, not understanding what it could mean, and hoping that it was just a bad dream. With the dawn, they would resume the search, and they would surely find her. In the morning, the captors decided to move the camp to a different location, but to Carrie's surprise, they only shifted it about 50 meters from the original campsite. Despite the ongoing search for her, Dan didn't hesitate to go hunting with his firearm, shooting a squirrel for breakfast. While Dan was preparing breakfast, the older man demanded that Carrie hand over her shorts, stating that their bright red color attracted too much attention. He took them and went back to the old campsite. This presented an opportunity for Carrie to talk to Dan alone. She tried to persuade him to let her go back to her family, telling him that he was too young for such crimes. Dan looked at her attentively, with no hint of a smile, concern, or regret on his face, and said, "No, you're cute, and you'll stay with me." Meanwhile, the second kidnapper returned and gave Carrie her shorts, stained with soot from the previous campfire. Trying to hold back tears, Carrie started putting on the shorts inside her sleeping bag. She was almost done when she heard rustling in the bushes to her right and saw a person lying flat on the ground. Dan quickly got up and drew his gun from its holster. Carrie shouted, "Stay back. Don't come any closer. They're armed and they'll shoot." "Shut her up," the older man ordered, grabbing his rifle. "Go away, they'll kill you," Carrie shouted again when suddenly a deafening sound echoed, and she was thrown backward. The searing pain pierced her chest, and she smelled the gunpowder. Dan repeated in shock, "I didn't mean to shoot her. I didn't mean to." Incredibly, Carrie thought, she had been shocked just at the moment when rescue was so close. The kidnappers made no attempt to help her, but from the bushes to the left, another person emerged. It was another ranch employee, Jim Schwalbe. Apparently, he didn't realize that the kidnappers were criminals and assumed they were part of a rescue team trying to help Carrie, possibly scaring off a bear but accidentally hitting her. Jim rushed towards Carrie, dropping his backpack on the ground. It was only then that he saw the chain around her waist under the sleeping bag and began to understand the truth. He demanded that the older man remove the chain from Carrie, while he continued to be threatened with the rifle. Dan threw his gun to the ground and took out the key to the chain. Jim then addressed one of the kidnappers, Alan Goldstein, telling him to run for help. But apparently, Alan had already figured out their true nature. He shouted that he was armed and ordered the kidnappers to surrender because they were surrounded by 200 people. At that moment, Dan violently yanked the chain, and Carrie screamed in pain. When Jim turned to look at them, the older man aimed the rifle at Alan. "No," Carrie gasped. A shot rang out, and everyone heard something fall in the grass. Jim rushed to the fallen friend, but the kidnapper had already disappeared from sight. The older man reloaded the rifle and aimed it in Jim's direction, but he was too far away by then. The kidnappers quickly packed their belongings into their backpacks, took the chain, and even dumped Carrie out of her sleeping bag, stating that she wouldn't need it anymore. They made no attempt to help Carrie or Allen, leaving them both lying on the cold ground. Carrie heard the crackling of Allen's radio but didn't dare hope to reach it as he was lying too far away. The cold penetrated her entire body, and with her last bit of strength, she attempted to crawl towards the extinguished fire. Lying on her stomach, she tossed some twigs and leaves towards the fire, hoping that there were still warm logs that could help the leaves catch fire. Carrie tried to blow on them, but she was too weak and lost consciousness. When she woke up, she felt an army of black ants rushing towards her blood-soaked shirt. No, she shooed them away. These insatiable insects reminded her of her thirst for life. She needed to find the radio and help Allen, but he had fallen too far away. However, she noticed Jim's backpack nearby. Her frozen fingers refused to cooperate, but finally, she managed to unfasten the backpack and found a water bottle, a chocolate bar, and a sleeping bag inside. The radio was not there. Carrie managed to put her legs into the sleeping bag and, finding some warmth, opened the water bottle. It turned out to be warm lemonade, and she took a sip and nibbled on the chocolate bar. Carrie once again tried to get closer to Allen, but this time, she had to drag the sleeping bag along with her. She couldn't help but feel like a caterpillar crawling on the ground and imagined how her brother Paul would react to that image. He would probably laugh and cheer her on at every step. She chuckled at the silly thoughts that come to mind in such moments. About 1.5 kilometers from the shootout site, other search teams continued their efforts, unaware of what had happened. Suddenly, Jim Schwalbe interrupted them. Gasping for breath, he shouted to the people surrounding him. There were 2 guys. They tied Carrie to a log and shot her when she yelled at us to stay away. Bob asked him if she was alive. She was when I ran away, but that scoundrel shot her, and the old man got Allen in the head. With every breath, life was leaving Carrie. Breathing became incredibly difficult, exacerbating the bleeding. A decision came to her intuitively. She closed her eyes and found herself back on the biathlon track. Biathletes practice their breathing technique methodically, just like speed and accuracy. Carrie focused, and very slow breathing, almost like in yoga, allowed her to slow down her heart rate and bleeding. Annoying flies buzzed around her, but strangely, they helped her stay conscious. She thought about Jim. He should have brought help by now, unless he ran into the kidnappers again. After a few hours, that annoying buzzing sound returned. Carrie looked around in search of the source and spotted a helicopter hovering above the treetops. It paused directly over her, and people were peering out of it. "Please, find us quickly," she silently pleaded. The helicopter flew away, but suddenly she heard the cracking of branches and the sound of a radio. "Help," she cried out with all her remaining strength. "Here she is," someone shouted. "We found her." "Are you okay, Carrie? Can you hear me?" asked a man. "Yes," she replied. She wanted to shout, scream, thank them for finding her, but all she could manage was a smile. Her eyelids felt heavy as if filled with lead, and it was hard to see what was happening next. While Carrie was being taken to the hospital, the police put all their efforts into finding her kidnappers. Little did they know it would be the beginning of a months-long search. The local forests and mountains cover hundreds of kilometers, and no one knows them better than the 2 fugitives. Over the course of 5.5 months, the kidnappers managed to elude the police successfully, and the media romanticized their image, calling them mountain men from another era. They portrayed Ran as a handsome prince and the other man as stern and loving father. It even reached a point where a local businessman wanted to sell T-shirts with their images. Meanwhile, the journalists overlooked the victims of their crimes. Then, about 2 weeks before Christmas, Sheriff Johnny France received an unexpected tip-off. One of his relatives noticed smoke on his ranch property in the woods. France had grown up on that ranch and knew every inch of it. It was dark, the radio had intermittent signals in the mountains, and the criminals could disappear at any moment. Nevertheless, the sheriff rushed to their camp. "Why did I go there alone?" "Because that's what I was paid for," he joked years later. He arrived as quickly as he could on a snowmobile, tracked down the father and son, and had them in his sights. The father immediately pulled out his rifle and threatened to shoot. In response, the sheriff warned that 2 shots would be fired at his son. He had to use the boy as leverage to get the father to listen. The sheriff convinced them that they could finally warm up, eat properly, and take a shower, which worked. Within minutes, the situation was fully under the sheriff's control. The kidnappers, Dan Nichols and his father, Don Nichols, were arrested and charged with kidnapping. Don was also charged with the murder of Alan Goldstein. At the trial, it was revealed that the men had planned the kidnapping several years ago. Dan refused to live in the mountains without a woman, and since not every girl would agree to their way of life, about 5 to 6 years ago, Don Nichols purchased a chain for his future bride. He dreamed of founding his own clan, living away from society, and Carrie was destined to play the role of the mother to his son's future offspring. Don was sentenced to 85 years in prison, but he was released in 2017. Dan was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he only served 6 years. It seemed that the young man had turned his life around, getting married, getting an education, and deciding to help disabled people. However, in 2012, he was arrested again in connection with illegal substances. As for Carrie, she spent 8 days in the hospital, and immediately after being discharged, she began pushing the boundaries of her own physical abilities, overcoming pain to speed up her recovery. By 1986, Carrie had recovered enough to participate in biathlon competitions in Oslo, Norway. She achieved a 4th place, but the athlete who finished 3rd invited her to stand with her on the podium, acknowledging her merits. To others, it might have seemed that she had fully recovered, but Carrie knew that the kidnapping and injury had left a lasting mark that would never disappear. She continued to experience pain from scar tissue and the bullet shrapnel still lodged in her body, affecting nearby nerves during significant physical exertion. As a result, she decided to quit competitive sports and focus on a career as a veterinarian, heading to study in Colorado. Today, Carrie Swenson works as a veterinarian in Bozeman, Montana, and continues to enjoy outdoor activities, which she has loved since her early childhood. She rarely talks about the events that happened and has become a harsh critic of the media's coverage of the kidnapping. In particular, she found the romanticizing of the kidnappers and murderers as rugged mountain men skilled in wilderness survival to be inappropriate. She also believed that the media significantly downplayed the emotional trauma of the abduction, portraying the experience as more romantic than it truly was in the hands of the mountain people. In 2012, when Dana was arrested again, Carrie wrote an article for the local newspaper, mocking the so-called mountain men. The Nicholses may have lived in the mountains at times, but they couldn't survive there, at least not without theft and robbery, often leaving the woods for months and buying modern equipment. In the end, they were so easy to catch because they froze, starved, and grew tired of mountain life. They are no true mountain men, she wrote. In 1994, in the small town of New Haven in the state of New York, 18-year-old Heidi Allen was abducted from the store where she worked. 2 brothers were accused of her kidnapping, but 2 separate trials led to paradoxical outcomes. All charges were dropped against one brother, while the other was found guilty. However, if you thought, well, at least they caught the guy who did it, by the end of this story, you'll likely change your opinion. On April 3, 1994, Easter Sunday, 18-year-old Heidi Allen began her shift at the convenience store attached to the D&W gas station in New Haven, a town in Oswego County, New York. Heidi was a determined and energetic young woman with ambitions of building a career in education or psychological counseling. Devoting much of her time to sports, her tall and robust build made her an invaluable member of volleyball and other teams. Despite her athletic prowess, she maintained a friendly demeanor, and everyone noted her warmth and responsiveness. Heidi had been working at D&W for over 2 years. It was her day off, but she agreed to cover a shift so that her colleague could spend the day with her children. Heidi's shift began at 5:45, and she arrived at work with her boyfriend. This was not unusual, as he often accompanied her to ensure she felt safe while opening the store very early in the morning. Typically, He would wait until the first customers arrived and then go about his day. That's exactly how it played out on April 3rd. Another customer entered the store but didn't see any staff. It might have seemed like the store was closed, but the gas pumps were operational and the lights were on inside. The customer went outside and flagged down a passing patrol car. Sheriff's deputies entered the store, finding everything seemingly in order. There was money in the cash register, and $9.50 was on the counter, left by another customer as payment for fuel and a newspaper. There were no signs of struggle or apparent issues. A security alarm was located under the counter, but it hadn't triggered that day. The officers discovered Heidi's car parked on the street, and her purse and car keys were still in the store. Despite the absence of signs of a struggle, the sheriff's deputies concluded that she might have been abducted, and the search for her began immediately. The state police offered assistance to the sheriff's office in Oswego County with the search for the missing girl. They had the resources to block all exits and ensure the abductor wouldn't escape. However, the sheriff inexplicably declined the offer, stating that his team could handle it on their own. Officers checked the punched receipts at the store's cash register and discovered that the last purchase was made at 7:42 when someone bought 2 packs of cigarettes. It was crucial to find this customer, as they were the last person to see the girl at work. Fortunately, the search for this individual didn't take much time. As soon as the news of Heidi's presumed abduction spread through the town, a man named Richard Thibodeau called the police. He claimed to be the one who was in the store that morning. The girl sold him cigarettes, and he left afterward. When extensive searches for the girl began, local residents, including Richard Thibodeau, his brother Gary, and his wife Teresa, joined in. Around the same time, Christopher Bivens contacted the police, describing how he drove past the store and saw 2 men leading a tall young woman toward a van. He thought one of the men was holding the woman tightly. He admitted he didn't remember the appearance of the van or the men, but noted that they were quite tall. Despite Richard Thibodeau voluntarily contacting the police and assisting in the search for the girl, law enforcement grew suspicious of him due to the timing of his purchase, just minutes before the concerned customer approached the sheriff's deputies. Additionally, he drove a van similar to the one described by Christopher. The police searched Richard's van, but nothing connecting the vehicle or its owner to Heidi was found. Richard willingly provided his fingerprints, blood samples, and hair without objection. Due to suspicions surrounding Richard, investigators turned a closer eye to his brother, Gary Thibodeau. After all, Christopher Bivens saw 2 men taking the young woman out of the store. Gary explained to detectives that he was still sleeping at home that early morning, and his girlfriend confirmed his alibi. A month later, the police charged Richard Thibodeau with the abduction. Gary was also taken into custody, albeit for a different minor offense unrelated to Heidi's disappearance. While he was in jail, law enforcement managed to build a case against the brothers. Suddenly, 2 inmates emerged, claiming that Gary had said Heidi was no more and she would never be found. Thus, detectives arrested a man who had voluntarily called the police and reported being in the store that morning. Despite no evidence against him, Richard willingly provided all the necessary samples and underwent a polygraph test. However, it seemed to have little significance. Richard and his brother Gary, a person with an alibi, were charged with first-degree kidnapping. A jury trial was conducted separately for Gary Thibodeau. During the trial, no concrete evidence or forensic testimony was presented, and Heidi was still missing. However, the prosecution was confident in their case. They called a witness who had seen 2 men with a girl near the store that morning, and jury members heard the statements of 2 inmates regarding Gary's alleged remarks about Heidi. Although the information provided by the 2 convicted individuals contradicted not only each other, but also established facts at that time, they were allowed to testify in court. The jurors heard that Heidi disappeared within just 13 minutes between the last recorded cigarette sale and the arrival of sheriff's deputies at the store. During these 13 minutes, the witness saw 2 men leading the young woman to a car. He described the vehicle as a white van with 2 dark blue or black doors at the back and 2 doors of the same color on the right side, along with a wide 6-inch black stripe above the wheels. The same witness, Christopher Bivens, identified the van as the one driven by Richard. However, it's crucial to note the interesting evolution in the testimony of this key prosecution witness. Initially, he could hardly recall anything about the men or the van where Heidi was supposedly placed. Suddenly, he could remember minute details, and the height of the men decreased to match the Thibodeau brothers' heights. Another customer from the store was called to testify. He made a purchase at 7:41, just a minute before Richard bought 2 packs of cigarettes. The man explained that there was a running van in the parking lot, and he assumed it was Richard's. He saw Richard in the store and, for some reason, believed there were 2 men in the van. Essentially, his testimony merely confirmed that Richard Thibodeau was in the store, a fact that Richard did not deny. A 13-year-old girl also provided testimony, claiming to have seen Richard's van parked at Gary's house shortly after Heidi Allen's disappearance. The girl insisted she remembered this because it was Easter Sunday. She had just woken up and looked out the window to see the van. However, after the trial, she recanted her statements, admitting that it could have been a dream. This constituted the evidence presented by the sheriff's deputies. The prosecutors had no concrete evidence linking the Thibodeau brothers to the abduction, no motive for the crime, and no logical explanation for why Richard Thibodeau would buy cigarettes if he intended to abduct the girl. Why not simply pocket the cigarettes when he and his brother allegedly took Heidi out of the store? Despite all this, Gary Thibodeau was found guilty of first-degree kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 25 years before being eligible for parole. During Richard's trial, nearly all the same evidence was presented, except for the testimony of the 2 inmates. However, since a different judge presided over the case, and there were different jurors, the outcome of the trial turned out to be entirely different. All charges against Richard were dropped. Richard returned to his family, while Gary began serving his sentence in prison. Gradually, the case of Heidi Allen's abduction began to fade from memory until an unexpected turn occurred in February 2013. A woman named Tanya Priest called the police, claiming she needed to unburden her conscience. She recounted a conversation that took place in 2006 when she gave a ride to her friend Victoria West to the trailer home where she lived with her boyfriend James Steen. The couple invited her inside, and as they chatted about random topics, a news segment about Heidi aired on TV. The girls started discussing what might have happened to her when James suddenly said, "Do you really want to know?" and began his story. It was the last thing the girls expected to hear. Steen revealed that he, along with 2 friends, Roger Breckenridge and Michael Borer, had abducted Heidi that day, taking her out of the store and putting her into Michael Borer's van. Borer was waiting in the van, meaning that 2 men took the girl out of the store, just as witness Christopher Bivens had claimed. The men then drove Heidi to the trailer home of Breckenridge's girlfriend, Jennifer Westcott, on Rice Road in the town of Mexico, Oswego County. Steen added that they had long gotten rid of that van, but the body could still be found in a shed in the woods across from where the trailer had been located. When asked why they had committed such a grave act, Steen explained that Heidi was planning to report to the police their involvement in illegal drug trafficking. At first, the friends didn't believe Steen, thinking he wouldn't harm a fly. However, a few years later, when Steen killed his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend, who happened to be his cousin, out of jealousy, Tanya Priest was no longer sure that Steen was so harmless. Interestingly, the police initially hesitated to believe Tanya Priest's words, but she was determined not to give up, and the officers eventually yielded to her persistent requests to investigate this version. They assisted Tanya in secretly recording a phone conversation with Roger Breckenridge's ex-girlfriend, Jennifer Westcott. In the phone conversation, Westcott admitted knowing about what happened to Heidi Allen and went so far as to say that the men didn't bring the abducted girl into her trailer, but left her in the van. However, when sheriff's deputies questioned Jennifer and presented her with the recording, she evaded and claimed she just wanted to quickly end the conversation with Tanya, agreeing with everything she said. During a polygraph test, she lied about knowing who abducted Heidi Allen. Despite this information, law enforcement did not actively pursue the case. At this point, Tanya reached out to Gary Thibodeau's lawyer because by then, she was convinced of his innocence and wanted to help him secure his release. It's worth noting that the main problem in this case has always been the motive behind the crime. It's entirely unclear why the Thibodeau brothers would kidnap a girl they barely knew. Similarly, the motive for 3 men to take such a heavy burden upon themselves remains unclear. However, it turns out that such a motive could exist, and law enforcement authorities did not want the truth to come to light. Heidi Allen, an 18-year-old employee at the gas station convenience store, had been a police informant for 3 years. 3 years ago, the girl got into trouble when she was caught by the police during a party her sister wanted to attend. As she was a minor and had put a child who was with her in the car in a dangerous situation, Heidi faced significant problems. In exchange for dropping all charges, the 15-year-old girl made a deal and became a police informant. Although she was a confidential informant, her status was revealed by a bizarre accident. Before she disappeared, Heidi worked with a sheriff's assistant, Chris Van Patten, who accidentally dropped her informant card with a photo and the codename Julia Roberts near the store where she worked. The card was found by Heidi's colleague, Kristen Duell, who returned it to the police. Kristen claimed that she only told her mother about it, but even if the girl told the truth, it is unknown how long the card lay on the ground and how many bystanders could see it. Inmates who testified in court against Gary Thibodeau claimed that Heidi was worried about Gary because he was planning to involve her in illegal dealings with controlled substances. However, firstly, one of these inmates later recanted his statement. Secondly, Heidi's diary was found, where she detailed her life, and there was not a single mention of the Thibodeau brothers. Thirdly, the information that Heidi was, in fact, an informant allows for the dismissal of these baseless insinuations. The newly revealed information provided an alternative theory about Heidi's abduction, especially considering that her status was compromised, and dangerous people could have learned that she worked for the police. Considering the new details, in 2014, after persistent demands from Gary's lawyers, searches were conducted in 2 cabins in the woods. One was literally opposite the place where Jennifer Westcott lived. Search dogs indicated the potential presence of remains near the cabin. Police found fresh shoe tracks at the site, and inside it was evident that someone had already dismantled the floorboards. However, the forensic examination conducted by the Bureau of Forensic Services did not detect any human remains. It's interesting that when Tanya Priest decided to share what she knew, numerous witnesses from the town immediately came forward, claiming to have heard James Steen, Michael Borer, and Roger Breckenridge boasting about Heidi's abduction. Some of these witnesses asserted that they had reported this to the police on multiple occasions. Even the key prosecution witness, Christopher Bivens, stated that Steen and Breckenridge looked much more like the individuals leading the girl out of the store. However, as he had never seen their photos before, he considered the Tibbett brothers as possible abductors. Around the same time, it was revealed that in 2004, Heidi's cousin, Melissa Searles, found an envelope in her mailbox containing a gold bracelet she had once gifted to Heidi. The envelope had no postage stamp, indicating that it wasn't sent through the mail, but was personally placed in the mailbox. Melissa claimed that she had not reported this discovery to the police for years because the entire family believed Heidi's abductor was already in prison, and there was no need to reopen the case. However, with the new abduction theory, she apparently felt compelled to share this information. In 2015, the appeal process regarding Gary's accusation began. The defense insisted on a new trial due to a wealth of newly revealed information. 52 witnesses, including 3 considered potential new suspects, testified. A key witness was a woman who drove past the DNNW store around 6 a.m. on April 3, 1994. She reported seeing an old, rust-covered van with no black stripe down the middle, confirming that it wasn't Richard Thibodeau's van. The defense tried to argue that the 3 men kidnapped the girl, forcing her into Michael Bohr's van, and took her to a cabin in the woods because they feared she would report them to the police. The men, of course, denied everything, but Michael Bohr slipped up by mentioning seeing Heidi's informant card near the store. Furthermore, Bohr told law enforcement that he wasn't a cruel person, so he couldn't have committed such a crime. However, this was untrue. Michael Bohr had previously been accused of kidnapping a young girl, making him, unlike the Thibodeau brothers, capable of such a crime. What's intriguing is that he was obsessed with this case, collecting a whole box of materials related to Heidi's abduction. One entry in his notes was particularly intriguing. He wrote as if a psychic told him that Heidi hid the bracelet behind the car seat. She added that Heidi hid an item where she was held, and all her family members would recognize it. Despite the abundance of new information, Gary lost the appeal after a year of hearings, and he was denied the opportunity for a new trial. From 2015 to 2018, subsequent judicial decisions also prohibited presenting new evidence due to doubts about the reliability of witnesses and the lack of sufficient proof to substantiate the alleged confessions of the 3 men. None of the 3, James Stein, Michael Bohr, or Roger Breckenridge, were charged in connection with Heidi's disappearance, Perhaps if Gary's lawyers had known about another crucial lead, they might have persuaded the judge to allow a new trial. The prosecutor informed the defense that he had provided them with all case materials. However, on December 13, 1994, he explicitly prohibited copying documents from a specific folder for the defense attorneys. Inside were 2 letters from the globally renowned expert in determining truthfulness, Murray Myron. His services were often sought by FBI agents, and he was asked to speak with a witness who might be the one who saw Heidi after her abduction. The expert concluded that Brent Moore's account of specific events related to Heidi was truthful and accurate. He did witness her being transported in a van, and she found refuge in a garage on the Barlow property in the town of Scriba. Brent was only 3 years old at the time of Heidi's abduction, and the expert was invited to verify whether the boy was telling the truth about the events of that day. The expert talked to the child, analyzed his drawings, and believed him. He advised looking for Heidi where the boy indicated. Interestingly, Brent knew Heidi before the abduction. His mother mentioned that during the Christmas holidays, after a visit to Richard Mitten, the boy's father, Brent mentioned seeing Heidi and that she gave money to Richard. When shown a photo of Heidi, the boy immediately recognized her and called her by name. Additionally, he accurately described her car. Brent added that 3 friends of his father were involved in Heidi's abduction, and the boy's mother remembered a conversation with her ex-husband on Easter Sunday in 1994, the day Heidi disappeared. She recalled how Richard suddenly claimed that 3 boys had kidnapped her. Who they were and whether they knew that Heidi was an informant is unknown. Investigators attempted to search the garage indicated by the boy, but couldn't conduct the search on either the garage or the adjacent area due to the lack of a warrant, and the homeowner did not allow the search. As evident, there are several theories about what might have happened to Heidi Allen besides the police's version implicating the Tibbetts brothers. It's possible that Stein, Breckenridge, and Bohr were the kidnappers, or perhaps friends of Brent Moore's father were involved. Since the girl was not found, there's also a more optimistic version suggesting that she entered a witness protection program. What if the police realized the danger they put Heidi in by making a teenager a confidential informant and then compromising her status? This could explain many unexplained aspects of the case. The appearance of her bracelet, the lack of signs of struggle in the store, the absence of evidence clearly pointing to any of the suspects. One might want to believe that she had to leave her family, but no one kidnapped her, and she is enjoying life somewhere in this world. Although one thing can be asserted almost certainly, when the sheriff's assistant dropped Heidi's informant card, he put an end to the life she had led until the age of 18. What truly happened on the morning of Sunday, April 3, 1994, remains unknown. It's possible that we may never find out. What we do know is that Gary maintained his innocence until his last breath. Gary Thibodeau passed away on August 12, 2018, at the age of 64, and his health did not allow him to live the additional 2 years to a potential conditional early release. Gary's departure means he will no longer have a chance to clear his name. Hope for another appeal in federal court died with him. He will remain a convicted inmate who abducted an 18-year-old girl and, according to many, is the second victim of this terrible and convoluted crime. The meeting went well. Janine smiled satisfactorily. She was sitting in the car with her friend Becky and a new acquaintance introduced to her by Becky. Janine was facing difficulties with her rapidly growing real estate business, and the man was supposed to help her. They met in the car due to the busy schedule of the women and to drive by and discuss one of the houses owned by Janine's real estate agency. They agreed on everything, and Janine was sure that the rough patch would soon be over. She would go on a cruise, and when she returned, work would fall into place, and she would receive $1 million, which she would put into new projects. Smiling happily in anticipation of change, Janine opened the car door and stepped out into the parking lot. But before she could take a few steps, she realized that none of her dreams were meant to come true. Janine Lee Monsell, 28, met Max Jones, 31, in early 1991. It was a fateful encounter. Until then, Janine had been desperately unlucky in love. She had been married twice before and was raising a son on her own. But with Max, everything was different. He was reliable and faithful, and they immediately developed feelings for each other. It only took them a few months to decide that they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. Janine and Max's wedding took place quite modestly in a local church in October of the same year, 1991. Soon after, their family began to grow. The following summer, their son Zach was born, and 2 years later, their daughter Alexandria, who everyone called Alex, arrived. The family lived modestly, but they managed to make ends meet. Janine tried several jobs. She tried working as a nurse and selling various goods, but her job failures were offset by her husband's stable income. Max was not only talented, but also hardworking as a carpenter. His skills were highly valued and he was never idle. Moreover, he never turned down extra work, and although the family didn't live extravagantly, they stayed afloat. The couple lived in a modest house in Northport, Florida, where they raised their children, attended church, and participated in the local community. They had many friends, were loved and respected by their neighbors, and seemed genuinely happy together. But soon, the situation took a sharp turn. In 1997, Janine got a job as a guard in a prison, but it led to a huge scandal. She engaged in a romantic relationship with an inmate, and after someone complained about their relationship, they were caught in the act, so to speak. Their prolonged affair was confirmed when letters from Janine to her lover were found in the inmate's cell. Though they were signed with a different name, it wasn't hard to establish their true author. To prevent further scandal and numerous interrogations, Janine resigned. But secrets are hard to keep, and rumors quickly reached her husband. Janine and Max had a falling out. It was a double blow for Max. Firstly, his wife had been unfaithful to him. Secondly, she had once again lost a job that provided a decent supplement to the family, which was barely making ends meet financially. The couple decided not to split up for the sake of their children, but trust was lost forever. They tried to pretend that everything was still the same, but longtime friends saw through the facade. It was just for show. One of the close individuals to the family was John Chamberlain. He met the couple at church, and since then, the two hard-working men, Max, working as a carpenter, and John, a locksmith, became best friends. Over the years, John observed how the spouses drifted apart. Janine and Max lived together, but besides their children and property, they had nothing in common. But gradually, even though love had long vanished from their relationship, the situation more or less stabilized. The children grew up, and each of the spouses socialized with their own circle of friends. In 2011, Max began to suffer from stomach problems, which led to a significant weight loss and multiple hospitalizations. However, doctors were at a loss and couldn't find the cause of his illness. Prior to this, he had never complained about health issues. The family did everything possible to alleviate Max's condition, hoping that doctors would soon understand what was wrong, but they were completely unprepared for how it would all end. Just 3 days after Thanksgiving in 2011, the family found Max near death. He was lying in bed, pale and unresponsive. Janine called 911. The dispatcher instructed her on how to administer first aid to Max, and Alexandria followed the instructions. Unfortunately, Max passed away in his daughter's arms. Paramedics arrived minutes later, but they couldn't do anything to help. Max died from a heart attack at the age of 52. Family and friends were shocked by his sudden death. They knew he was ill, but they thought it was related to his stomach. The news of the heart attack came as a thunderbolt out of the blue. It was very difficult for Zach and Alexandria, who were 19 and 17 years old respectively, to cope with the loss of their father. Nevertheless, a doctor signed the death certificate, and Max was cremated 2 days later. Now, it was up to Janina to provide for the family. Considering her previous employment difficulties, it seemed like an insurmountable task for her. But to everyone's surprise, she not only managed but also significantly improved the family's financial situation. Of course, a big help was the $1 million insurance payout she received after her husband's death. But she didn't just sit on it. Using the money, she opened a real estate agency and began renovating and renting out homes. Like many cities in the USA, Northport experienced a real estate boom in the early 2000s. But the 2008 crisis hit the real estate sector hard, and many homes were foreclosed by banks. They stood abandoned, waiting for new owners. These homes became an opportunity for someone like Janine, who had the money to take advantage of the situation. Naturally, Janine also found herself and her children a better place to live. Explaining her actions by the need to move on, she sold the house and all of her late husband's belongings, including his musical and work tools, which he cherished dearly. But it didn't stop there. She began spending a lot of time with her new friend Becky. She drank, used drugs, and spent money on travels, cars, and even a second home in the Great Smoky Mountains area in Tennessee. To those who knew her behavioral changes seemed astonishing. It seemed strange to acquaintances that one could forget a husband with whom Janine had spent 20 years so quickly. Finally, changes awaited Janine in her personal life as well, when she met Matthew Riley Smith, a cable television installation technician. Matthew was only 26 years old. He was half Janine's age and only a few years older than her son. Nevertheless, in July 2012, Janine announced to everyone that she and Matthew had married during a recent trip to Las Vegas. Zach and Alexandria didn't like that their mother had remarried so hastily, especially considering that Max had passed away less than a year ago. They tried not to conflict with Matthew because he hadn't done anything wrong to them, but they disapproved of their mother's eagerness to move on so quickly. Nevertheless, Matthew Smith became a part of Janie Ain's personal life and business, but Matthew's help turned out to be insufficient. In fact, the business was so successful that Janine soon needed an employee, and she turned to her old friend, John Chamberlain. Besides being a locksmith, he had many other skills necessary for home repairs. Janine offered John a job with the condition that he and his 11-year-old daughter would live in one of her houses and pay a very low rent. It was a lucrative offer, and John agreed. Everything went well for a few months, but soon doubts began to creep into the man's mind. John Chamberlain was particularly troubled by the number of houses where all his work involved drilling the lock on the front door. Janine reassured him that this was just a routine part of the job. Since the houses had been empty for a long time, there was no way to contact the previous owners and obtain keys. But John wasn't satisfied with this explanation. Nevertheless, he continued to do repairs for Janine, not taking any action, until one significant moment. His worst fears were confirmed when he answered a call from one of Janine's tenants. The tenant told him that a stranger had just knocked on their door and inquired about what they were doing in his house. To get to the bottom of the situation, John gave the tenant Janine's personal number. Within minutes, she called him back and was furious. John told her that if she was involved in something illegal, he didn't want to be a part of it. In response, she ordered him to vacate the house and sent Matt to deliver the message in person. The encounter between the men ended in a fight. Janine sent John an eviction notice, but he refused to leave, and the matter went to civil court. Additionally, John went to the police. He met with detectives and told them about his involvement in Janine's business, which he believed to be illegal. They listened carefully and said they believed his suspicions. This encouraged him to also share suspicions about the death of Max Jones. Despite Max's stomach problems, his heart attack came as a surprise, and it seemed that Janine wasn't grieving at all. She had remarried a younger man and was living a luxurious lifestyle. But what troubled him the most was that Janine had cremated Max within 2 days of his death without allowing an autopsy, and she found no better way to deal with Max's ashes than to hand the urn to John. Thanks to John Chamberlain's tip-off, the police began monitoring Janine, hoping to learn more about her suspicious business and the death of her third husband. And the police found something. Although Janine and Matt were renovating and renting out properties, they had no connection to any of these houses. They hadn't purchased them or obtained ownership rights to rent them out. Janine would go to the tax assessor's office and file documents formally renouncing her rights to the properties, but with a forged signature. Considering she was renovating and spending large sums of money on the houses, who wouldn't believe they belonged to her? All that was left was to drill the locks, tidy up the house a bit, and it could be rented out. She deceived unsuspecting people out of tens of thousands of dollars. and she even gave them a prepaid phone number to avoid leaving any traces to her. So she was enraged when Jon gave the tenants her real phone number. Her business was a scam from start to finish. Furthermore, Giannini didn't have a license to work as a realtor. But that was just the beginning of the investigation. The screws were tightening around Giannini, and she made a desperate attempt to get free. Although it's unknown for certain if Giannini knew that Jon had gone to the police, she decided that the legal proceedings with him posed enough of a threat to her business to take action. Whom did she decide to turn to with her problem? Of course, to her best friend Becky. She told her that Jon was too informed about her affairs, and the court proceedings were costing her too much money. So, they needed to deal with him. Becky promised to help. She had acquaintances, not always acting within the law, and one of them could help solve this sensitive issue. On February 20th, 2013, Becky and Janine met for lunch at a restaurant to discuss the details. They needed to make sure they understood their plan before Becky introduced her friend to her acquaintance. During lunch, Janine described Jon Chamberlain's appearance, gave his address, and even drew a schematic of the house on a napkin with indications of the best points from which to enter. Janine insisted that the matter needed to be resolved as quickly as possible. She planned to go on a cruise and wanted to ensure she wasn't in town during the murder to have an alibi. Becky promised to pass the information to the hitman, and 5 days later organized a meeting with him. On February 25th, Becky and Janine met with the executor, got into his car, and discussed the final details. Janine handed the man a photo of Jon Chamberlain and said it would be preferable to break his neck to keep the crime scene clean. In the worst case, he could be shot. The main thing was to get rid of the body. As she added, if the body can't be found, nothing can be proven. They drove past Jon's house where she explained how to break in and warned about any possible threats, such as the man's 11-year-old daughter. Waving her hand, she stated that the girl didn't concern her, and if she got in the way, they should deal with her too. The important thing was that her body wasn't found either. The driver stopped the car in the parking lot and at some point asked Becky to step out of the car to discuss the final details of the matter alone with Janine. As if the random victim in the form of an 11-year-old girl wasn't horrifying enough, by the end of the meeting, Janine made another chilling proposition. She asked if she could get 2 for the price of 1. She was tired of her 4th husband, Matthew Smith, and wished to rid herself of the burden and threat. Just on January 3rd, his life insurance policy worth $1 million came into effect, and he would be more useful to her dead than alive. Janine proposed getting rid of him a couple of weeks after Jon. But in his case, it was harder to accomplish because he might have a weapon on him, and there were surveillance cameras in the house. She suggested staging his murder as a carjacking. The killer agreed to all her terms, and she agreed to pay $4,000 for each man. She brought $1,000 with her, ready to hand it over immediately to confirm her seriousness of intentions. When the meeting was over, a satisfied Janine got out of the car. Seconds later, she was surrounded by police officers and arrested. Her initial fear and shock quickly turned to anger as she realized she had fallen into a classic police trap. For the past few weeks, she had been the subject of an investigation under the codename Black Widow, and it was all because Jon wasn't the only one who went to the police. Janine's best friend, Becky, was also cooperating with the detectives. While she did have connections in the city's underworld, she chose to take a different path. An informant called the police, reporting that his friend wanted to report a planned contract killing. This friend turned out to be Becky. When they were discussing the murder details in the restaurant and Janine was drawing the victim's house plan, Becky had a microphone and camera on her. In the car, she introduced Janine to Officer Dominic Harris, who of course recorded the entire conversation. The man needed Janine to do several things that would later help convict her. He needed Janine to provide a photo of Jon Chamberlain. She had to show where he lived. She had to say how she wanted him to be killed. They needed to discuss the cost of the hit. He needed Janine to give money for the murder. The man played his role perfectly, even though it was difficult for him to hide his shock and disgust when Janine casually dismissed Jon's daughter as a nuisance and later talked about Matt's murder. Janine was charged with 2 counts of solicitation to commit murder and faced 33 charges related to her business, ranging from robbery to criminal use of personal information and operating as a realtor without proper authorization. Her husband, Matt Smith, was horrified when he was told that his wife had planned to have him killed. He himself was arrested on March 15, 2013. Initially, he was reluctant to cooperate, but the 30 charges of fraud persuaded Matt, and he offered to testify against Janine. In exchange for his testimony against his wife, he was offered a great deal. In January 2014, after spending 6 months in prison, he pleaded guilty to only 1 charge. He was sentenced to 4 years of probation and ordered to pay $17,500 to the victims of their scam. However, Matt never got to testify in court. In May 2014, Janine announced that she didn't want to contest the charge. This means that she doesn't admit guilt, but is willing to accept the punishment that the judge will impose. Janine claimed that her impulsive decision to hire a hitman was influenced by drugs and alcohol, and that she was not a danger to society. However, she was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Of course, the police tried to investigate her involvement in the death of Max Jones. When John Chamberlain approached the police, they listened carefully to him and didn't dismiss his words because they had heard the name Janine Jones before. They had witness statements claiming that Janine Jones had approached them to obtain drugs that, in their opinion, were used to kill Max. However, in the state of Florida, if a doctor signs a death certificate stating that the death occurred due to natural causes, an autopsy cannot be performed. Not to mention that the quick cremation of the body deprived the police of any evidence. Officially, Max Jones died of a heart attack. As prophetically stated by Janine herself, if there's no body, you can't prove anything. Unfortunately, she was right about that. Nevertheless, Max's loved ones believe that it is right for her to spend the rest of her life in prison. During Janine's sentencing, John Chamberlain sat next to Max's father. When the judge rendered her decision and said that Janine would never be released, Max's father turned to John, placed his hand on his shoulder and said, "Thank you for achieving justice for my boy." Eliza Levy was young, worked a lot, and loved adventure. She had her whole life ahead of her, but suddenly she was kidnapped by strangers. They took her deep into the forest, tied her to a tree, and threatened to brutally harm her and her family if she didn't obey. Her relatives were beside themselves with worry. An elite group of police agents got involved. But could Eliza do something herself to escape? Using an unusual tool, she put a risky plan into action. Then, one night in the dark, she noticed some lights. Was this the end of the nightmare? Or would it start again with renewed force? The 24-year-old Eliza Levy can be called a child of 2 worlds. Her father, James Levy, was an American born and raised on Long Island, just a few miles from New York City, while her mother, Alicia Ortiz, worked as a school teacher in Ecuador. They fell in love when James was a Peace Corps volunteer in the 1980s and soon married. Of their 4 children, 2 received dual citizenship in both the U.S. and Ecuador. James believed that raising their children in the U.S. was best, but he unexpectedly found them drawn to the peaceful, slow-paced life of South America. So the couple built a home in the middle of the Ecuadorian jungle, just across the border from Colombia. Together, they founded the organization Al Tropico to protect the invaluable tropical forest surrounding them. Eliza, the eldest of the 2, adored life in the wilderness. Her adventurous spirit kept her constantly on the move, always ready to search for new bird species or explore uncharted territory. When she returned to Ecuador, she enrolled in university, where she studied botany and biology. It was here that she found a serious passion: cycling. She organized weekly races through the streets of Quito and took long trips across the country. Her other passion became Al Tropico, the group founded by her father. She volunteered, guiding school children through the jungle, teaching them to identify hundreds of species of local birds. The dense jungles of Ecuador are home to many plants and birds, but they also provide the perfect hideout for criminals. And the country's northern border is notorious for its security problems. Illegal militarized Colombian organizations smuggle contraband and prohibited substances into Ecuador, and often used small villages on the Ecuadorian side as refueling stations. In 2009, the most infamous of these organizations was FARC, Colombia's left-wing extremist guerrilla group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. It was FARC that held politician Ingrid Betancourt hostage in the jungle for 6 years, a story that spread across the world. However, when you grow up in a region, even one as troubled as this, life from the inside often feels completely different. This is why Eliza never felt unsafe in any part of Ecuador. And it was precisely for this reason that she suspected nothing when a man called her, explaining that he was from her hometown and, as an official, wanted to launch a new bird research project in another city near the Colombian border. Eliza agreed to meet him to discuss the details, as long as he sent a driver to pick her up. They settled on that arrangement. On Saturday, October 17, 2009, one of Eliza's brothers dropped her off at the meeting spot with the driver of an Isuzu trooper. Eliza got into the SUV, but before doing so, she asked her brother to write down the vehicle's license plate number just in case. At first, everything seemed normal. The driver was calm and friendly, but an hour into the drive, he picked up 2 strangers, claiming they needed a ride. In reality, they had other plans. The men pressed the barrel of a gun to Eliza's neck and demanded that she stay quiet. The strangers were driving Eliza to an unknown destination, but her family in Quito had no idea. The last they'd heard was that she was heading to a meeting about tropical birds. When she didn't return to the city as expected and failed to call, they became worried. Even then, they didn't think the worst, assuming instead that a mudslide, a fairly common occurrence in Ecuador, might have delayed her. At the time, Eliza's father, James, was in San Francisco attending an environmental conference. The family didn't want to alarm him, but after 2 days of growing panic, they sent him a message. On Monday, October 19, 2009, 2 days after Eliza's disappearance, her mother, Alicia, received a call from a stranger. He told her not to worry, that Eliza was fine and with them in Colombia. The caller made it clear that Eliza had been kidnapped, but was in no rush to make demands. Eliza's father caught the next flight back to Ecuador. At first, the Levy family hoped to resolve the situation without involving the police. The question they faced wouldn't have crossed the mind of someone from any other country. Was it even worth calling the authorities? In Ecuador, not everyone trusts the police. Even in the case of a serious crime like kidnapping, some Ecuadorians try to solve the problem on their own. But there was another option. Ecuador's police force has an elite unit specifically for dealing with kidnappings known as UNAS. This unit, made up of 100 specially trained agents, is tasked with tracking down kidnappers and helping families through the harrowing ordeal of a loved one being abducted. They assist with negotiations, ransom discussions, and, when possible, organize rescue operations. The Levy family contacted UNAS. It's worth noting that while kidnapping an American in Ecuador is not unheard of, it is usually a less dangerous scenario, where a tourist is held in a taxi for a few hours and forced to withdraw cash from an ATM. This time, however, the situation was far more serious. The most terrifying possibility was if the kidnappers had ties to FARC, the Colombian guerrilla group. In that case, Eliza could be taken deep into the jungle and held for years. Given this, the UNAS specialists advised the family to also contact the U.S. Embassy in Quito. On the morning of Wednesday, October 21st, 4 days after the kidnapping, FBI agents, UNAS officers, and other agents arrived at the Levy home. They promised to try to track down the kidnappers, but they emphasized that the most critical and delicate task in securing Eliza's release would be communication with the criminals. The leader of the kidnappers had left Eliza's mother with a phone number, but who would have the courage to call him? The agents decided that Eliza's father, James Levy, who was known by the Spanish version of his name, Jamie, was capable of handling the delicate task of communicating with the kidnappers. With the agent's guidance, of course. They handed him a sheet with potential phrases the kidnappers might use and how he should respond. After a brief briefing, James made the call to the leader of the kidnapping gang. He had to ask his wife to leave the room to avoid breaking down in front of her. The conversation lasted 4.5 minutes, and the kidnappers didn't allow James to speak with his daughter, claiming she wasn't with them. However, the most important information they gave him was that Eliza had been kidnapped for ransom, and they would later reveal the amount. James held himself together remarkably well during the call, but that evening after the agents left, he locked himself in his office with a bottle of whiskey and broke down in tears. He was overwhelmed with guilt, blaming himself for what had happened. For years, he had worked with various organizations and groups on both sides of the Ecuador-Colombia border, and he had arrogantly believed that his family was safe from harm. At the same time, Eliza was being held in a remote area of Ecuador, less than 200 miles from her family. She had no way of knowing that they were fighting for her release. All she knew was that the past few days had been the most painful, disorienting, and terrifying of her life. After the strangers jumped into the SUV, they pressed a gun to her neck and promised that nothing would happen to her as long as she behaved sensibly. They threw a towel over her head, cuffed her hands, and gagged her. Then they dragged her from the front passenger seat to the back, laying her on the floor. One of the men moved to the front while another stayed in the back to guard her. Eliza didn't even think about resisting. Everything had happened so fast that she hadn't fully realized she had been kidnapped. It felt like a dream, but it was a nightmare she couldn't wake from. They drove off-road for over an hour, bouncing along rough terrain. Then, the vehicle came to a sudden stop. The door opened. She heard someone approach. A man told her to get out and walk with them. Eliza recognized his voice. It was the man who had arranged the meeting about tropical birds. They led her somewhere to what she sensed was an even more dangerous and isolated place. From the moment she fell into the hands of her captors, Eliza resolved to remain calm and alert. She knew that one wrong move could cost her life. When the captors finally removed the blanket from her head, Eliza saw that they were heavily armed, their faces concealed by ski masks. They told her they were part of a paramilitary group and that the threat extended not only to her, but also to her family in Quito. They claimed they had stationed people around her family's home and warned that if she made any foolish moves, her family would suffer. The men asked if she had a GPS chip implanted under her skin, a measure that wealthy individuals in Latin America sometimes take to track their location in case of kidnapping. That's when Eliza realized that the gang believed she came from a wealthy family. She assured them this wasn't the case, but the men were convinced that her American father would pay a large ransom for her. After that, they forced her to record a message on a phone for her parents. She spoke under their direction. "Mom, Dad, I'm okay. Just do what they say and don't talk to the police." She tried to speak calmly, knowing that her mother would be terrified beyond words. The men then took her phone, watch, and tablet from her backpack, but left her with a change of clothes, a book, and something else she wouldn't remember until much later. They chained her to a tree, next to which they had hastily set up an improvised tent. Under the guidance of the agents, Eliza's father, James, negotiated with the kidnappers regarding the ransom. He knew that kidnappings were common in Ecuador, but he had always believed his family wouldn't be affected, as they didn't have the money to make them targets. However, in a country where being an American often equates to being seen as wealthy, his worst fears were confirmed when the leader of the gang valued Eliza's life at $1 million. Following the agent's instructions, James told the kidnappers that he wouldn't even consider paying a ransom until he was certain his daughter was alive. Although the criminals had forced Eliza to record a message for her parents, they never sent it. So James asked questions only Eliza could answer, such as the names of her grandmother and godfather. When they received the correct responses, the family was finally assured that Eliza was alive. The urgent issue then became how to raise the money. Despite the U.S. Embassy providing every possible support to the family, they were unable to offer the ransom. If the embassy were to pay $1 million for every kidnapped American, it would set a dangerous precedent. Essentially, the family only had their house, and the bank agreed to loan them $80,000 with the home as collateral. In desperation, James called his relatives in New York, and his brother and sister decided to give him all the money they had saved for retirement. James and his wife planned to sell the house afterward to repay their siblings. James informed the kidnapper that the maximum they could gather was $150,000, but the captors insisted the ransom should be closer to $1 million. With each conversation becoming shorter and more tense, the agents knew time was running out. They hurriedly began surveillance on known criminals in the region who could be suspects. Meanwhile, the family had no idea what Eliza had already endured or what lay ahead for her. By this point, she had spent 2 weeks chained to a tree, only able to move as far as the chain would allow. Exhausted and with limited mobility, she fought to stay strong, but it was becoming harder to battle her fears. Nighttime was her only solace. when she imagined she could hear her mother's voice. She found comfort in this imagined whisper, and, though she had never been particularly religious, she began to pray. Of course, Eliza had no idea that U.S. and Ecuadorian agents were hunting her kidnappers, let alone that Colombian specialists had joined the investigation. Colombians have extensive experience dealing with kidnappings, and their assistance proved invaluable. They provided high-tech equipment to track the leader of the gang's mobile phone. Naturally, there was no guarantee that he was in the same location as Eliza, but investigators had other leads to follow. The most useful lead came from Eliza herself when she asked her brother to record the SUV's license plate number. Investigators matched this number with those of vehicles captured by surveillance cameras at toll booths. They identified the vehicle used by the kidnappers, which had passed through several toll booths and was heading towards the Colombian border. During her captivity, Eliza interacted only with the two guards who watched over her. The leader of the gang would come and go, staying in a cabin about 50 yards from her tent, and she rarely saw him directly. The two guards played the classic roles of good cop and bad cop. The guard Eliza privately referred to as the good guy would bring her rice and beans and assured her that she would be released soon. In contrast, the other guard, the bad guy, threatened to kill her and her family. He also menaced that he might sell her to a larger, more dangerous group. Eliza understood that he meant FARC, an even more brutal gang experienced in holding hostages. While she was terrified, she cried alone, unwilling to show weakness to her captors, especially the one who was threatening her. It took a lot of willpower, but Eliza gradually managed to overcome her fear. She daydreamed about riding her bike, feeling free. Deciding to take action, she tried to gain the favor of the good guy guard. Indeed, he began talking to her more frequently during meals and even brought her yarn and knitting needles. She knitted 4 scarves for him, hoping to learn more about her family in exchange. He told her that her parents were alive and negotiating for her release. However, her hope was quickly dashed when the other guard openly threatened to cut off one of her fingers to increase the pressure on her parents. After 18 days of captivity, Eliza could no longer simply sit and wait for rescue. There were times when the two guards would wander far enough from her tent that she was only held back by a chain with a small lock. The knitting needles they had given her were too big to be of any use, but she wondered if she could find something to break the lock. Her desperation sparked creativity. The kidnappers had taken all her gadgets but left her backpack. At the bottom of the bag, she found some bobby pins. Eliza took 2 pins, bent them, and began to pick at the lock, as she had seen in movies. For the next 3 days, whenever the guards were out of sight, she worked on the lock. She tried over and over again until one day it finally clicked open. With incredible willpower, she managed to stay calm. One of the guards seemed ruthless enough to shoot her if she tried to escape, so she climbed nearby trees to get a sense of her surroundings, trying to see if there was any visible path or if the jungle was too impenetrable. Then she would return, sit down, and relock the chain. Eliza was terrified of being caught. With each attempt, she grew bolder. She had resolved to take the risk and escape from her captors. She closed her eyes, praying for guidance from her mother. At that moment, she thought she heard her mother's voice saying, "Don't risk it, don't run, wait 2 days." Eliza decided to heed the advice and wait, though not for long, as she noticed the guards' growing tension. Her time was running out. Eliza had been independent and comfortable in nature since childhood, and now she used those qualities to keep her mind occupied. She spent hours watching the trees, trying to identify the birds by their colors and songs. During the day, she reread the only book she had with her, a Colombian romance novel. But then the night would come again. The chains around her ankles prevented her from sleeping more than an hour or 2 at a time, and every rustle in the jungle could signal new danger. On the night of Saturday, November 7th, she suddenly woke up in the middle of the night and distinctly heard some sounds and saw the lights of flashlights. In the dim light, Eliza could only make out silhouettes. There were many of them, and they carried military-grade weapons. The silhouettes moved hurriedly. Eliza feared that these were FARC members. She imagined she might spend years with this group in the Colombian jungle. As the lights and shadows approached her tent, one of the men leaned in. He said something, but she couldn't hear him over her cries and pleas not to take her away. He then said that they were police officers, that they knew her father Jamie, and that they had come to rescue her. When Eliza heard her father's name, a wave of joy washed over her. She could only hope this was not a dream. The officers covered her with a bulletproof blanket and stayed with her while they conducted the operation to capture the armed kidnappers. When UNAC officers called the Levy family to inform them of Eliza's rescue, her mother, Alicia, answered the phone. Suddenly, she began to scream and jump for joy. The family describes this as the best moment of their lives, as if they could breathe freely again. They had to wait a few more hours to learn that Eliza was unharmed and safe. NAS officers brought Eliza back to Quito. Although she was eager to reunite with her family, the UNASE officials had other plans. They wanted to highlight the successful operation to rescue the hostage and encourage other families to seek police assistance without fear. To publicly showcase the moment of reunion, they held a brief press conference before introducing Eliza to her parents. After 3 weeks of anxious prayers and waiting, her family finally embraced her. As for the kidnappers, they turned out to be ordinary criminals rather than a militarized group. Eliza's testimony helped to charge the leader of the gang and the guard who had been kind to her, while the second guard managed to escape. Despite spending 3 weeks in a tiny tent, Eliza tried to maintain a positive outlook on her experience, particularly appreciating the beautiful forest that surrounded her. While no one would wish to spend 21 days in the jungle, she found it far better than being confined in a small, dark room. Her positive attitude helped her recover quickly, and she eventually became a source of strength for her family. Remarkably, just 8 weeks after returning home, Eliza embarked on a cycling trip across South America. She traveled 4,000 miles, and the local press covered her journey. She claims that the sense of freedom she experienced while cycling made the trip a healing experience for her. The offended ex-husband, the jealous, despotic boyfriend, the rejected suitor, a one-night stand partner, a teenager with a string of police involvements, or a niece with a better friend. One of these people killed a loving, caring, joyful mother of 3, sending the police on the trail of possible leads to catch the murderer and attempting to seek justice for the victim and her family. The question remains, will justice be served? Nature generously endowed Dana Laskovski with the best qualities one could find in a person. At 36, Dana was a very beautiful and lively woman, a kind and responsive friend, a talented artist, and a loving mother. Children constituted the most important part of Dana's life. Above all else in the world, she wanted to be a mother, but for some time, she and her husband Sam struggled to have children. However, when their family expanded to 3, Dana and Sam's happiness knew no bounds. Yet in 2000, the couple separated, and Dana, along with the children, moved to a new home in the charming town of Puyallup, Washington. In 2001, she turned her love for children into a profession. Someday she dreamed of opening her own daycare, but for the time being, she worked as a nanny. In addition to this, Dana actively supported her 17-year-old niece, Amanda, during times of difficulty with her parents. For Amanda and her best friend, Emily, Dana was the aunt that every teenager dreams of having. The girls often stayed overnight at Dana's, sought her advice on any matter, and in general considered her more of an older friend than an aunt. The rest of the important people in Dana's life included Mike, whom she met approximately a year after parting ways with her husband. Mike was a pleasant man residing in Canada, but made the effort to visit Dana as often as possible, especially since the drive wasn't too time-consuming. Unfortunately, not everything was smooth in their relationship. Dana's best friend, Shauna, and Mike's best friend, John, didn't speak highly of Mike. The main issue in their relationship was that Dana was a very beautiful woman who often attracted the attention of other men, something that, to put it mildly, did not sit well with Mike. And one of the men who showed interest in Dana, thereby irritating Mike, was Patrick. Patrick worked for a telecommunications company and met Dana when he connected her television after her move. The new neighbor immediately caught Patrick's eye, but she politely rejected his advances. However, he continued to send her flowers and love notes persistently. Initially, Dana probably considered these gestures harmless. When Mike saw flowers from a competitor, he became jealous and very angry. He demanded Patrick's phone number and address, promising to deal with the persistent suitor the same day. Dana did not appreciate this. Firstly, she just wanted to continue ignoring Patrick. Secondly, she didn't want her boyfriend making decisions for her. Mike and Dana argued, and they even decided to temporarily part ways. During this period in August 2001, which coincidentally preceded Dana's death, she had dinner with her friend Shauna. To their surprise, Mike's best friend John joined them. John had recently broken up with his girlfriend, and Dana and Mike were on a break in their relationship. That evening, fueled by alcohol and caught up in the moment, they became involved with each other, much to Mike's dismay. Literally the next day, Dana received a note from her admirer Patrick, in which threatening undertones prevailed. It was probably only then that Dana realized she had a stalker. Patrick hinted that he had been watching her in her home. To her horror, upon inspecting her rooms, she indeed noticed that the protective screen had been removed from the window, as if someone had entered her home that way. Coincidentally, in August 2001, Dana's ex-husband Sam attempted to re-enter her life. Sam arrived unannounced to inform her that he had sold their house. For months after their separation, they had been trying to sell the house, so he bought a bottle of champagne to celebrate this development. Sam hinted at wanting to reconcile, expressing that he wasn't ready for a divorce, but they ended up having another argument, and Sam had to leave. On August 31st, 2001, the family for whom Dana worked as a nanny couldn't reach her. Dana never missed work, and certainly not without informing her employers. The family tried contacting Dana's neighbors, but they also couldn't get through to her. Concerned, they called the police and requested a welfare check to ensure everything was okay. When the police arrived at Dana's home, they knocked on the door. Getting no response, they circled the house and found the back door slightly ajar. Upon entering, they walked through the kitchen and discovered a woman lying face down on the couch. It was Dana, and she was dead. She lay in an unnatural position, with one arm above her head and the other beneath her body twisted in a strange way. Dana's neck showed signs of bruising. It was evident that she had been murdered. The officers immediately secured the crime scene and called in detectives. Examining the crime scene and finding bloodstains on the carpet, investigators concluded that Dana had struggled with someone before her death. After the murder, the assailant placed her on the couch, added a pillow, and covered her with a blanket, as if attempting to make her more comfortable. This strongly suggested that the crime was committed by someone known to Dana. On the other hand, a broken window hinted at a possible robbery gone wrong, especially considering the entire house had been ransacked in search of something. Investigators were perplexed, with half the evidence indicating a personal vendetta and the other half suggesting a robbery. After the autopsy, the forensic pathologist confirmed that Dana had been strangled. The murder was characterized by extreme brutality. Initially, she was severely struck on the head before being strangled, resulting in a broken trachea. This level of force indicated a very strong perpetrator. It seemed likely that the attack was not premeditated, as the killer had to pass through the kitchen, where knives were available, but chose not to use them, and instead opted for bare hands. When a wife is murdered, one of the first focuses of the police is on the husband. It quickly emerged that Sam had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on his wife. The police rushed to find him, but Sam had seemingly disappeared, becoming the prime suspect. As it turned out, Sam had gone on a camping trip with the children. He had no mobile reception throughout the night and was unaware of Dana's death until he returned to civilization and received a barrage of calls and messages. When detectives finally managed to speak with Sam, they noticed bruises on his knees. He explained that he was into baseball and got the bruises during a training session. Regarding his relationship with his wife, Sam mentioned they were not living together, had arguments, but were trying to compromise. When asked where he was on August 30th at the time of the murder, Sam said he was at home with the children, briefly left while they were sleeping, but only to refuel before his upcoming trip. Since Sam couldn't definitively prove where he was at the time of the crime and was not overly cooperative with the police, investigators tried to build a case suggesting he might have gone to see his wife on August 30th, perhaps to discuss child custody, had an argument, and killed Dana. However, his actions didn't fit the timeline of the crime. It seemed implausible for Sam to put the triplets to bed, drive 2 hours to his wife's house just to argue and kill her, then make his way back and nonchalantly take the children for a relaxing outing the next morning. This version of events didn't withstand scrutiny, but suspicions weren't entirely lifted from him either. Surveying friends and family of Dana, investigators shifted their focus to a more likely suspect, Patrick, who had been harassing the woman. Shortly before her death, Dana told friends that Patrick had become fixated on her. She realized he was truly stalking her because he knew about things he couldn't have learned through other means. It reached a point where Dana informed the family she worked for that if she were to die unexpectedly, Patrick would be to blame. Adding to this, witnesses had seen a white van, similar to Patrick's, near Dana's house in the days leading up to the crime, painting a less favorable picture for the investigator. The police obtained a warrant to collect Patrick's DNA and search his home and van. Patrick reacted harshly, being rude and uncooperative when they arrived. However, as officers began the search, Patrick reviewed the search warrant and only then realized they were investigating Dana's murder. He had initially thought they had come to arrest him for harassment. Once he grasped the gravity of the situation, his behavior immediately changed. Patrick agreed to provide fingerprints, a DNA sample, anything to assist the investigation. He also mentioned his whereabouts on the night of the murder. After work, he stayed late with friends. His alibi was fully corroborated. Detectives reluctantly had to acknowledge that Patrick had been incredibly lucky because many witnesses and circumstantial evidence had pointed to him. Deprived of a potential suspect, investigators turned their attention to Mike, Dana's boyfriend. However, before they could talk to the Canadian, they discovered interesting information about him. Dana's best friend, Shauna, reluctantly admitted that Dana was unhappy with Mike's constant control lately. Additionally, Dana had cheated on Mike with his best friend, John. Curiously, John was genuinely in love with Dana, desired a serious relationship, and believed Mike wasn't a suitable match for her. In Dana's infidelity with John, investigators saw a clear motive. Mike could have committed the crime out of revenge, aligning with the theory that the attacker was someone Dana knew. When investigators traveled to Canada and spoke with Mike in person, they saw a man deeply affected by the loss of his loved one. He disclosed that he was already aware of the infidelity and had forgiven Dana. On the night of the crime, he couldn't reach Dana by phone. Displeased with how their last meeting ended, he decided to drive to her. Investigators were optimistic, thinking they finally had a breakthrough in the case with a suitable motive: jealousy. However, Mike continued his narrative, revealing that he was stopped by Border Patrol. They halted him, then turned him back because his driver's license had expired. This information was confirmed by Border Control. While investigators considered the possibility that Mike might have found another way to enter the States, they were beginning to realize that this was yet another dead end. All the likely suspects in Dana's murder had alibis. Frustrated after 5 months of investigation, the Washington police sought assistance from an FBI profiler to help them create a profile of the perpetrator. Notably, they hadn't completely ruled out Dana's husband Sam as a suspect at that point. However, the profiler confidently stated that Sam wasn't the one who killed his wife. If Sam had committed the crime, it would have been planned, and he would have used a weapon. Moreover, Sam could have easily devised an attack plan during the 2-hour drive from his home to hers. The crime wouldn't have occurred on a day when he had custody of the children. Even if it was an unplanned attack, there would have been bruises on Dana's face, because a man in a fit of rage would start with facial blows. Shocked by the news of Sam's innocence, the profiler asked if any of the people they interviewed displayed signs of remorse. He reminded the detectives that Dana knew her killer, and they were now searching for someone haunted by guilt. The police tried to look at the case from a different angle. It was then that they discovered something that matched this rather specific characteristic. In the book where guests could leave farewell messages at Dana's funeral, Amanda, her niece, left a rather interesting note. She apologized to her aunt for not being the best niece and wrote that she had been sober for 37 days, refraining from any prohibited substances. In principle, these words did not contain anything incriminating, especially considering that the girl had lost her beloved aunt, who had always been a friend and support to her. Nevertheless, there was something in them that made the investigators take a closer look at her. Amanda was invited to the police station for questioning. Now, with Dana, her protector, absent from her life, Amanda found herself in even worse company than before. The girl was genuinely devastated by Dana's murder and shared that her aunt had always been the person she could turn to when she had problems or when her relationship with her parents was strained. The police asked Amanda if she knew anyone who would go as far as to murder a woman who cared so much for her. They reminded her of how horrifying the last moments of her aunt's life were, possibly even showing her some images, and the girl broke down. She provided the police with the name of one of her friends, Blaine. Amanda told the police that Blaine had a violent temper and had once tried to push her onto the couch and assault her when she rejected his advances. She added that he had also been in Dana's house, and after her murder, he observed the crime scene from across the street while forensic experts worked. Furthermore, after her aunt's murder, she noticed scratches on his hands. Digging into Blaine's past, the police found that he had a history of various offenses. They were eager to talk to him, but there was a problem. Blaine had disappeared. He was living in a southern state, making extradition difficult, and he showed no willingness to cooperate voluntarily. Trying to find a way to question him, the detectives decided to start with interviewing his friends. This led them to his friend, who happened to be in jail at that time. When they explained that they wanted to question Blaine as a suspect in Dana Laskovski's murder, the friend exclaimed, "Wait, Blaine didn't kill Dana. Emily killed Amanda's aunt." Emily, Amanda's close friend who frequently visited Dana's house. The friend added that there was no doubt that Emily did it. They had long nicknamed her Mutant because of her inhuman strength. Emily could defeat anyone in arm wrestling, and her favorite move involved a grip that allowed her to practically choke her sparring partner. It was at this point that investigators realized they had overlooked a potential suspect who stood at only 158 centimeters tall and weighed 54 kilograms. The police brought Emily to the station. She was clearly not inclined to cooperate. She behaved overly confidently, was rude to the police, and when they listed all the witnesses pointing to her, she became furious and declared that she had nothing to do with the crime. She couldn't provide an alibi either. The police obtained a search warrant for her residence, where they found a blouse stolen from Dana. Apparently, Blaine's friends had pointed them to this detail. They revealed that Emily not only stole the blouse, but also appeared in it at Dana's funeral. In Emily's apartment, the police also found the girl's diary containing several intriguing entries. Firstly, Emily wrote about Amanda, stating that she could strangle that wretch, just like her aunt. Secondly, the girl had a to-do list for her life, and among the 10 various points, one stood out: kill someone and not get caught. These entries provided a kind of admission and motive, but the detectives understood that this was not sufficient for a confession. Moreover, any defense attorney could easily challenge such evidence. What a 17-year-old girl wrote in her diary might not be taken seriously in court. The police needed to get Amanda's confession. They invited the girl to the station again, this time directly accusing her of leading them astray several times and threatening to charge her as an accomplice. Under pressure, she revealed everything. On the evening of August 30th, when they went to her aunt with Emily, they were under the influence of illicit substances. The teenagers wanted to ask Dana for money, but Emily behaved strangely, rudely, and sharply towards the homeowner, forcing her to ask the girls to leave. Emily refused to leave. Then Dana gently touched the girl's shoulder to escort her to the door, but Emily suddenly became furious. She struck Dana on the head. Interestingly, this detail was not reported by the media, so Amanda could only have known it if she had truly witnessed the murder. After that, Emily applied a choking technique, just as Blaine's friends described. She used a scarf to strangle Dana, showing no intention of stopping. Amanda turned away, unable to watch what was happening. She heard a crunch, then wheezing, and finally, it became very quiet. Dana was dead. The girls took the money they could find and left. Amanda admitted that she did not expect everything to end this way. She thought Emily would simply anger Dana to the point where she would forbid them from coming to her home again. Detectives now understood that the crime was both an attack on a carefully chosen victim and a robbery. On the one hand, the girls needed money. On the other, Emily envied her friend's relationship with her aunt, and out of jealousy, she decided to get rid of Dana once and for all. On March 13, 2003, Emily Lonborg was charged with first-degree murder. She had already turned 18, and they were planning to try her as an adult. However, prosecutors were not confident they could secure a conviction. Emily did not confess to anything. The testimony of Amanda played a significant role, but it couldn't be relied upon since, upon seeing her friend in the defendant's seat, Amanda might retract her statements. If charges were brought against Amanda, she could invoke the right to remain silent. Even with Amanda's testimony, prosecutors were uncertain they could convince the jury that a petite teenage girl could strangle an adult woman with her bare hands. They made what was perhaps the right decision in this case. They negotiated a deal. Emily admitted guilt to involuntary manslaughter and received less than 7 years of imprisonment. Amanda was not charged. Justice, to some extent, prevailed. However, this case leaves a bitter taste because, in prison, Emily exhibited model behavior. Additionally, the time she spent in pre-trial detention was counted towards her sentence. Therefore, after just 5.5 years, she became a free person. She got married, changed her name, and became a mother. Emily Lonborg, who left 3 children without a loving mother, now enjoys the life she stole from her victim. On Thursday, July 19, 1990, residents of Florida, Steve and Jane McGowan, received a letter from their 34-year-old sister, Beverly. She bid them farewell and wrote that she was embarking on a journey to find herself in this world. Beverly added that she was quitting her job and selling her apartment because she intended to leave immediately. The contents of the letter deeply shocked the brother and sister. Beverly had worked hard and was satisfied with both her job and her new home. She had recently acquired the apartment she had dreamed of and worked 2 jobs to pay off the mortgage. Jane hurried to the police station to report her sister's disappearance, but the authorities could do little since the letters stated that Beverly had left of her own accord. The letters were written in Beverly's handwriting on notepad sheets found at her home. So Steve and Jane went home to Beverly in Pompano Beach to try and find answers to their questions. They immediately noticed that Beverly's red Volkswagen Fox was not in its usual parking spot. Beverly herself was not in the apartment, but it did not give the impression that she had packed up and left for good. There were dirty dishes in the sink, a nightshirt lay on the unmade bed, and clothes hung in the closet. However, there were also signs that Beverly had no intention of returning. The phone was disconnected, the answering machine was missing, and there was no sign of her 2 cats. Steve and Jane rummaged through drawers and discovered that Beverly's passport, birth certificate, and address book were also missing. Beverly worked in the loan department of a bank and had a part-time job at a non-profit organization. Steve contacted the bank to see if her colleagues could shed light on the situation. They informed him that the day before he received the farewell letter, Beverly had taken a sick day, citing illness. This was unusual considering Beverly's reputation as a responsible and reliable employee. During the phone call, she also mentioned that she no longer wanted to live in her apartment and asked them to sell the mortgaged property and get rid of her personal belongings left in the apartment. Beverly was asked to send a telegram confirming her request, and such a telegram was indeed received. Although the circumstances were strange, Steve and Jane had to believe that their sister had truly left without explaining herself to anyone. However, Steve managed to convince the police to file a missing person report, and he closed Beverly's credit cards. He reasoned that closing the cards would disrupt her travel plans and anger her enough to compel her to contact the family. On the same evening that Steve and Jane were inspecting their sister's apartment, a fisherman and his young niece went to search for bait for an upcoming fishing trip. They arrived at a wide irrigation canal located 160 kilometers north of Pompano Beach in a remote area of St. Lucie County. Leaving his niece in the car, the fisherman began walking along the canal when he noticed something that appeared to be a bag of trash. As he approached closer and realized what it was, he hurried back to the car and contacted the police. Deputies from the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office, who arrived at the location indicated by the fisherman, discovered the body of a woman. It was evident that the perpetrator not only took her life, but also made every effort to prevent her from being identified. However, he overlooked something. On the woman's right ankle, hidden beneath her jeans, there was a small tattoo of a yellow rose. The description of the tattoo was released to the media in the hopes that local residents could identify it. Steve McGowan had already returned home when the phone rang around 10 p.m. It was a friend of his missing sister. She had just heard the news about the discovery in the St. Lucie Canal and the matching tattoo that Beverly had. The next day, Steve and Jane went to St. Lucie to speak with investigators and show them a photograph of their sister's tattoo. Due to the condition of the body, traditional identification methods had to be ruled out, but both of them were confident that it was their Beverly, Dental records comparison confirmed that it was indeed her. The inspection of Beverly's apartment did not reveal any blood or suspicious items. There were no signs of a struggle. Steve and Jane couldn't understand who would harm their sister. She loved her family, especially her nephews, and they loved her. Beverly was not wealthy and was not involved in complicated relationships. Her life was overshadowed by the fact that her two boyfriends died in separate car accidents. However, despite her past, Steve was confident that Beverly had been quite content with her life recently. Although Beverly worked 2 jobs, it was not enough to cover her mortgage payments. To increase her income, she started renting out one of the bedrooms in her apartment. During the search of her apartment, investigators found a notebook with a list of potential tenants. Each entry included the full name, phone number, and the scheduled time for viewing the apartment. Except for one. The first line only had the name Alice and was marked for Tuesday at 6:30. After meeting Alice, Beverly spoke highly of her. The woman had come from London, dressed impeccably, drove an impressive car, and worked for the renowned company IBM. Alice had moved to the region because she was temporarily transferred to the company's office in Fort Lauderdale. She had impressed Beverly to the point that she chose her as the new neighbor and informed her friend that Alice would be moving in on Friday, July 20th. By the way, Beverly mentioned that Alice introduced her to numerology. Alice attempted to predict Beverly's future, but she needed various numbers that held significance in Beverly's life, such as her date of birth, passport number, social security number, and even details from her driver's license. Strangely enough, Beverly provided her with all of these numbers. Overall, she was satisfied with Alice's predictions about her future and shared them with her friends. Unfortunately, she did not share the last name of her new neighbor with them. Alice's identity remained a mystery. Additionally, there was no evidence to suggest that Alice had moved in or even visited Beverly's apartment. The investigators reached out to IBM, where they were informed that they had no employees from the UK working in the South Florida area. They didn't even have an office in Fort Lauderdale. The investigation into Beverly's finances revealed that on the day her body was found, someone withdrew $795 out of the $800 that was in her bank account. Her credit card was then used to purchase women's clothing and books at a shopping center in Miami. The salespeople who served the customer described her as a bright blonde with a British accent. The description matched that of a tall blonde woman who had attracted nationwide attention at the time. 8 years earlier, in 1992, police officer Lori Bembinek had been sentenced to life in prison for the murder of her ex-husband's former wife. The case had caused a sensation. Lori's glamorous appearance combined with the high-profile nature of the case made her somewhat of a celebrity. A few days before Beverly's murder, Lori had escaped from prison in Wisconsin. When the Miami salesperson was shown photographs of Lori Bembinek, they recognized her as the woman who had used Beverly's credit card. The police were puzzled as to how the convicted killer's path could have crossed with that of a modest bank employee until it was discovered that Lori had actually fled to Canada and was not in Florida at the time of the crime. However, on Friday, July 20th, one day after Beverly's body was discovered, her card was used again in Miami, this time at a travel agency. The cardholder had a notable appearance. It appeared to be a man dressed as a woman. The person wore a cheap black wig in the style of Cleopatra and oval-shaped glasses. The man spoke with a British accent and introduced himself as Sam. Apparently, Sam was planning to fly to London in 2 days, on July 22nd, and used the card to purchase a ticket for British Airways Flight 92. Detectives examined the passenger registration records for Flight 292, as well as all other flights heading to Britain on July 22nd. Beverly McGowan's name was not on any of them. However, Beverly's car was found in the airport parking lot, where it had been parked for 5 days. Fingerprints found inside the car yielded no significant results, but 4 synthetic black wig hairs were discovered. British Airways Flight 292 arrived at Heathrow Airport on Monday, July 23rd, according to London time. After landing, a passenger with short black hair and oval glasses approached the Avis car rental counter. The passenger, presumably Sam, booked a car in Beverly McGowan's name and handed over her driver's license as proof. Beverly had shoulder-length dark hair and wore glasses. The person at the counter resembled her. The clerk asked for a credit card to pay for the car's fuel, and Sam handed over Beverly's Visa card, but the card was declined. Sam explained that they might have exceeded the limit and paid in cash. In reality, by that time, Beverly's brother Steve had cancelled her credit cards. When Florida detectives learned about this unsuccessful transaction, Sam had long disappeared. Since the credit card was no longer active, its transactions could not be traced. Sam's arrival in Britain meant that he was beyond the jurisdiction of American law enforcement agencies. Florida detectives contacted the London police to request their assistance. Detective John Cornish agreed to help with the international investigation. He spoke with the Avis company and instructed their staff to direct the suspect to their nearest office if he contacted them. Later that same week, Sam did contact Avis. He requested an extension on the car rental, and he was asked to visit the nearby Avis office. The police waited for him at the location, but Sam never showed up. A backup plan was devised, where officers would wait at Heathrow Airport on the day of the car's return. That day arrived, but Sam once again failed to appear. In the early morning hours, Sam's abandoned car was found a few miles from the airport, devoid of any clues. Suspecting that Sam might be attempting to fly back to the United States, Detective Cornish ordered his team to board all flights heading to the US on that day to check the passengers, but this endeavor proved futile. The police missed the opportunity to apprehend the criminal. The only lead the police had left was British Airways Flight 292. Since Sam didn't use Beverly's passport to board the flight, it meant he had booked a ticket under a different name. Investigators attempted to examine the 248 passengers on that flight, but by law, they were not allowed to check passengers who didn't reside in Florida. Therefore, they sought assistance from the U.S. State Department in Washington, D.C. Each passenger's name had to be compared with passport details, and since there was no unified database that consolidated all this information, the process could take years. It wasn't until January 1996 that the State Department provided the police with a name they deemed important. Sylvia Ann Hodgkinson, a British citizen, was on Flight 292. The photo in her passport depicted a woman with dark hair and eyebrows. After her husband's death, she was forced to move into a women's shelter if she had nowhere else to go. Less than a year after her husband's death, a passport was issued in her name. Investigators suspected that someone else had impersonated Sylvia to obtain documents in her name. Since they couldn't locate Sylvia in any way, there was concern that she had suffered a fate similar to Beverly's. The State Department also discovered an intriguing connection between Sylvia and two other women, Charlotte Ray Cowan and Elaine Parent. All three identities turned out to be inadvertently linked after an incident that occurred a year after Beverly's murder. On May 22, 1991, North Miami police approached a woman in a rented car. The car had been rented 6 months earlier in Los Angeles and was overdue for return. Stolen license plates were attached to the car to conceal its origin. Inside the car sat a tall, red-haired woman who identified herself as Charlotte Ray Cowan and presented her documents to the officers. It was clear that Charlotte had been staying in the car with 2 dogs. Several wigs, the woman's personal diary, and a number of documents with Charlotte's photograph but different names, Sylvia Hodgkinson and Elaine Parent, were found in the car. The police arrested Charlotte based on her failure to return the rented car. She spent a night in jail and posted bail the next day. Remarkably, despite the woman's obvious use of false identities, the police took no action regarding this matter. On the day of Charlotte's court hearing for the offense, one of the arresting officers was present in the building. When it was time for Charlotte to appear before the court, a redhead woman stood up. However, the officer who had arrested Charlotte was shocked. The woman summoned to court by the subpoena was not the same woman he had taken into custody. Charlotte herself couldn't understand why she had suddenly received a court summons. She asked the officer if the woman he had arrested was tall and a redhead. When he answered yes, she confidently stated that she knew exactly who it was. Nearly 10 years earlier, in the mid-80s, Charlotte was relaxing at a bar in Orlando when an elegantly dressed woman with a British accent approached her. She had short red hair, like Charlotte, and amazing blue eyes. The woman introduced herself as Anne Trumont and offered to buy Charlotte a drink. Charlotte accepted the offer, and they engaged in casual conversation. During their chat, Anne casually brought up the topic of numerology. She mentioned that she would be happy to create a corresponding matrix for Charlotte and started by asking for her date of birth. One by one, Anne extracted Charlotte's social security number and driver's license details. She jotted everything down on a napkin and gave Charlotte a positive prediction about her future. Anne and Charlotte became instant friends and started communicating. A few days later, Charlotte met Anne's brother, a tall blonde man with the same elegant demeanor as his sister. However, over time, the women saw less of each other until they completely lost touch. So Charlotte was quite surprised when, several months later, Anne called her and said that her aunt had passed away, leaving her a significant inheritance. Anne was supposed to share the money with her brother but claimed that he had decided to have her institutionalized to claim all the money for himself. About a month after the phone call, Anne appeared on Charlotte's doorstep at 3 a.m. She had a mustache, wig, and a man's shirt with a tie. Sobbing, she explained that she had escaped from the institution where her brother had placed her. She was hiding from her family and needed help to disappear. Anne begged Charlotte to allow her to take her birth certificate so that she could create a new identity for herself. Initially, Charlotte refused, but she reluctantly agreed when she saw how distraught Anne was. Her friend promised to return the birth certificate soon. Weeks passed, and Charlotte heard nothing from Anne. She began to worry. Then, finally, she received a letter with the birth certificate and a note from Anne, apologizing for the delay. Charlotte didn't hear anything more about her friend until the moment she received a court summons in 1991. Hearing this fascinating story, the investigators became intrigued by the identity of the elusive and enigmatic fraudster, Elaine Parent. Like others, Parent was a real person, but little was known about her life. She was born in the Bronx, New York, on August 4, 1942. She was the only child of loving and fairly affluent parents. By the time she reached adulthood, she had transformed into a tall, slender beauty with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. At the age of 30, she moved to Florida and worked for a while at a real estate agency until her arrest in 1976 in Fort Lauderdale for shoplifting. Her fingerprints were taken and stored in the database. Then, in 1985, she stole jewelry worth $40,000 from an elderly acquaintance. This was around the same time Parent met Charlotte. Parent's fingerprints were compared to those of the woman arrested in 1991 for failing to return a rented car. They matched. The woman masquerading as Charlotte Coven was Elaine Parent. Naturally, the conclusion was drawn that the new neighbor, Beverly McGowan Ellis, the elusive suspect Sam, and Elaine Parent were one and the same person. However, they still needed to directly link Elaine to Beverly's murder. The detectives reviewed the evidence in the case and examined a notebook containing letters Beverly had written to her brother and sister using an electrostatic detection device, ESDA. This specialized equipment is used to detect indentations or impressions on paper left by previously written letters. The analysis of the notebook revealed that it had been used for a series of other letters written not in Beverly's handwriting. It seemed the author was a woman who held a strong grudge against Beverly. The messages were rather aggressive and contained threats. The letters were compared to handwriting samples from Elaine Parent, and they matched. The letters written by Parent were addressed to a woman in London who held a high-ranking position as the CEO of a major company. For her safety in the case materials, she was referred to as Witness X. She shed light on many gaps in the life of the elusive fraudster. The woman revealed that she had met Elaine during a trip to Miami in the 1980s, and they quickly became friends. In 1985, when the police were searching for Elaine for the jewelry theft, she apparently fled to London and asked Witness X if she could stay with her. However, the two young women soon realized that they couldn't live together due to Elaine's explosive temperament and instability. In 1990, the con artist returned to the United States, but to Witness X's surprise, she returned to London at the end of July. She was driving a car rented from Ives. 3 months after her return to London, Parent stole 2 dogs belonging to her former friend and escaped to the United States. From there, she sent threatening letters to Witness X and attempted to extort a ransom for her dogs. These dogs were evidently the same ones found in her possession during her arrest in Miami in 1991. By the end of 1996, Parent faced charges of passport forgery from the State Department, but they had no idea where she could be hiding. In 1998, the television show America's Most Wanted aired an episode about Elaine Parent. When the show began, Patricia Nevins from St. Petersburg, Florida, was at home watching television. As soon as she saw Elaine's photo, she immediately recognized her. Patricia Nevins was a church worker and knew Elaine as a blonde named Sandra Little. Patricia met Sandra Little in 1992 when she was living in a homeless shelter in St. Petersburg. Patricia allowed Sandra to stay in her vacant bedroom, and she remained with her for almost 1.5 years. During this period, Sandra filed a lawsuit against a restaurant where she slipped and injured herself. She won the case and received compensation, the amount of which is undisclosed. Patricia described several curious incidents that occurred while she lived with Elaine. Elaine once told her that one way for her to lead a dignified life was to assume a different identity. Then, during a dinner party, Parent mimed cutting a guest's hand to steal a gold bracelet. Patricia arranged for Elaine to speak with a psychiatrist, who later informed Patricia that Elaine was an extremely intelligent sociopath who would leave Patricia's life as quickly as she entered it. This prediction came true when the women went their separate ways in 1993. After the police publicly appealed to the community to help capture Elaine, an intriguing letter was delivered to the office of the St. Lucie County Sheriff. Inside was a copy of a painting done in oil colors. It depicted Elaine Parent wearing a teal-green swimsuit and pearl earrings. Her hair was grey and styled in the same manner Parent often chose. She was portrayed coming out of a pool. On the back, it was printed, "Best wishes, your chameleon." Psychiatrist Barbara Canavan, who had been assisting the police in the case, stated that Parent both desperately needed and feared police attention. The painting is very telling. She sent it to the police to taunt them, as if to say, "I'm alive, I'm okay, look for me, but you'll never find me." In February 1999, Elaine was featured in the documentary series World's Most Wanted, which brought her international attention. Reports poured in from around the world claiming to have seen Parent in Turkey, France, Australia, and South Africa. The press dubbed her the most wanted woman in the world. In April 2002, America's Most Wanted aired another episode about Elaine Parent. Following the program, numerous calls came in from the affluent neighborhood of Panama City, Florida, claiming that a woman living there was Elaine. 3 police officers were dispatched to the address. They arrived at a modest single-story house and knocked on the door. A middle-aged brunette woman, dressed in a beige silk pajama set, answered the door. The officers explained why they had come to see her. The woman introduced herself as Darlene Thompson and presented them with her military ID, which featured her photograph. She did not resemble the photograph of Elaine Parent that the officers had seen. Realizing that the neighbors had made a mistake, The officers nevertheless asked her to accompany them to the station for formalities. Darlene agreed and requested that the officers wait while she changed clothes. While the officers waited outside the bedroom, one of them examined Darlene's ID. Being a former military personnel, he immediately noticed a crucial missing stamp that confirmed the document's authenticity. The officer knocked on the bedroom door to clarify this matter, to which she responded that she was getting dressed. The officers waited for her to come out, but she never appeared. A gunshot rang out, and the officers rushed into the bedroom only to find Darlene dead. Subsequent fingerprint analysis officially confirmed that Darlene and Elaine Parent were the same person. It turned out that the house where Elaine lived belonged to another woman. Elaine had been renting a room from her since August 2001. The homeowner described her as a pleasant woman with a passion for cooking. During the search of the house, Elaine's Florida driver's license was found, featuring her photo but under the name of the woman she was staying with. In a notebook, she had written down information about a man from the neighboring town of Lynn Haven, including his social security number and credit cards. Elaine's closet was filled with wigs and both women's and men's clothing. A book on learning the French language and another on theatrical makeup were also discovered. Some acquaintances of Elaine mentioned that she often worked on a laptop, but it was never found. The diary she had with her when she was arrested over 10 years ago as Charlotte Canavan was also missing. Another intriguing detail to the portrait emerged. The police found a flyer with a photograph of Elaine and the name Antonia Racemen. The flyer stated that she was being sought by the FBI for the murder of a government official at a hotel in Washington. Interestingly, it appeared that Elaine had created the flyer herself, and the local police chief later speculated that she had made it to intimidate someone. The death of Elaine left many unanswered questions. The police believe she had up to 20 different identities that she used across the world, including the USA, UK, Turkey, Israel, France, and South Africa. Some suspect that she may have committed more murders, but no additional victims have been found. 3 years prior to her death, investigator Norma Pfeiffer told the media, "The brutality of the Maguire murder makes me think that someone capable of this has either done it before or will do it again." Opinions are divided as to whether she worked alone or had an accomplice. Some argued that she couldn't have managed Beverly on her own. And let's not forget about the attractive blonde man she presented as her brother. Psychologist Barbara Kerwin described Elaine as a virtuoso in her field, capable of effortlessly reading people's souls and uncovering their vulnerable spots. However, the motive behind her crimes remains completely unclear. Why would someone with Elaine's high intellect choose to engage in criminal activities instead of achieving great heights in any other field, especially considering that her crimes brought her more infamy than wealth? But Kerwin believes she knows the reason behind Elaine's schemes. She was driven by her own psychological demons, Barbara stated. "I believe she impulsively stole the identities of others to fill her own emptiness." The story of Tim and Charlene's meeting resembled a romantic fairy tale. Two intelligent, attractive, and successful young individuals were ready for marriage and, upon meeting each other, immediately understood that their union was meant to be. Over the course of 3 years, they tied the knot, moved into their own home, and welcomed a little daughter into their lives. However, after the arrival of their child, money became tight for the family, so Tim and Charlene decided to sell their beloved pickup truck and buy a simpler car. In May 2013, Charlene posted an online ad. And now, she nervously paced the room of her house. Tim had been gone for over an hour, and she was starting to panic. Even if the men had decided to take the car for a test drive, they had been gone for too long. Charlene called her husband multiple times, but all the calls went to voicemail. He hadn't responded to her messages. Although she knew for certain that Tim had charged his phone before leaving for work, when he still hadn't returned late into the night, Charlene called the police to report her husband's disappearance. The Hamilton police took the disappearance of the 32-year-old man very seriously. Canine search teams and search and rescue teams were deployed, not to mention the hundreds of Ancaster residents who joined in the search efforts. Despite the community's involvement in the search, many suspected that the man had simply run away, possibly due to a disillusioned life or accumulated debts. However, the detectives found no evidence to support these theories. The police organized a press conference where Charlene directly addressed the abductors, pleading for them to release Tim and emphasizing the need for their little daughter to have her father, and for her, a husband. Barely holding back tears, she added, "It was just a car, just a silly car." It was only when Charlene uttered those words that everyone realized, all at once, that the car was the very reason for the man's disappearance. And thus, anyone could become a victim simply because they decided to sell their pickup truck. 3 days later, Tim's phone was found. It was discovered by a worker in the grass near a construction site, approximately 20 minutes away from Hamilton. However, there was no sign of Tim or his pickup truck nearby. The discovery of the phone itself was not significant since the police had already obtained all the necessary information from the telecommunications company. Detectives started investigating the phone number from which potential buyers of the pickup truck had called Tim. It turned out that the phone was registered under a false name and address. But Tim was not the only one listed in the outgoing calls. The persistence of the criminal who had used the number multiple times led the police to Igor Tumenenko, an Israeli army veteran who was selling a similar Dodge Ram and had posted an advertisement online. Igor told investigators that he had taken a test drive with 2 men just 2 days before Tim's disappearance, but unlike Tim, Igor had returned home after the drive. Perhaps it was because Igor was a tall, robust former soldier who could resist attackers if necessary. But most importantly, Igor provided the investigators with a description of the men, mentioning that the tall guy had a small bag slung over his shoulder and a tattoo on his wrist that read Ambition. During the subsequent press conference, the police shared the description of the 2 men with journalists, and within 2 days, colleagues from Toronto contacted them, claiming to know exactly who the Hamilton police were looking for. They identified the wanted man as a young millionaire, playboy, and one of Canada's most eligible bachelors, 27-year-old Delan Millard. Long before the police took an interest in him, Delan Millard was a young prodigy. At the age of 14, he made headlines as the youngest Canadian to pilot a helicopter and an airplane on the same day. Born in 1985 to Wayne and Madeline Millard, Delan was the heir to the multi-million-dollar airline company Millard Air, founded by his grandfather. However, by the time he turned 20, the guy dropped out of university and led a rather idle lifestyle. Delan threw poolside parties, drove the most luxurious cars, and was always surrounded by glamorous women. He allowed his friends to live in his numerous houses and apartments, and he moved so frequently that some of the household staff never even met him. 2 months before the events described, his father unexpectedly passed away, leaving Delan as the inheritor of the family fortune. According to his friends' estimates, it ranged from $10 to $20 million. It was hard to believe that a millionaire, with a garage full of luxurious cars, would be capable of kidnapping someone over a pickup truck. The police put Delan under surveillance and discovered that he was friends with an employee of the airline named Mark Smick. Unlike Delan, Mark did not come from wealthy parents. In fact, he made a living by selling illicit substances. However, what was of greater importance to the police was the extensive list of criminal offenses associated with Mark. At the same time, by comparing the footage from several surveillance cameras, the investigators pieced together the events of that evening. Shortly after the pickup truck left Tim's house, a dark SUV can be seen closely following it in the video. Delan was behind the wheel of one vehicle, while Mark was driving the other. It cannot be stated with certainty, but Tim was likely already dead. Half an hour later, the cars stopped, and the criminals changed the license plates of Tim's pickup truck to avoid police detection. Now that they had obtained the desired pickup, their next task was to get rid of its owner. At 2 a.m., they arrived at the Millard Air hangar. The pickup was towing a large trailer with some heavy equipment on it. Mark and Ellen entered the hangar, and soon sparks and flames started to emerge from the equipment on the trailer. This mysterious fire would burn throughout the night. Early in the morning, when Tim had been missing for 12 hours, Millard Air employees received a message from Delan instructing them to stay away from the hangar. Arthur Jennings, an employee of Millard Air, recalls that the demand was explained to him as company policy. On Tuesday, he obediently avoided entering the hangar, but on Wednesday, he came across a pickup truck identical to the one described in the news. The man didn't know what to do. Deciding to photograph the vehicle and its identification number, he dialed the anonymous crime reporting hotline and requested it to be checked. They confirmed that it was the same vehicle. The man was so shocked that he felt physically ill. Fearing for himself and his family's lives, he only reported what he had learned on Friday. By that time, the pickup truck was no longer in the hangar. Fortunately, thanks to the phone data and Igor's testimony, the police already had a suspect. On May 11th, 4 days after Tim's disappearance, Delan was arrested by the Hamilton police. Charlene was relieved, thinking that her husband would now be found quickly. She didn't know that the police no longer expected to find him alive. Acting on a tip from neighbors, officers arrived at Delan's mother's house, where they discovered the pickup truck in a large trailer on the driveway. The pickup had been partially dismantled and meticulously cleaned, but despite that, they found Delan's fingerprints and traces of blood inside. The keys to the pickup are still hanging on Delan's keychain. But what about the equipment that the pickup was towing that night? The police searched all of Delan's apartments and homes. On his farm, they found an industrial incinerator for burning various types of waste. This huge furnace was the very equipment from which sparks of flame were seen on the night of Tim's disappearance. Inside the furnace, forensic experts found small bone fragments, including human teeth. Due to the intensity of the fire, obtaining DNA was impossible. However, it is presumed that the bones belonged to Tim, and on May 14th, the police officially announced his death. Astounded by their findings, the investigators wondered if there could be other victims among Delan's acquaintances. They continued to search Delan's farm, but by that time the Toronto police had already missed 3 crucial clues, each of which could have saved Tim. The first was the mysterious disappearance of 23-year-old aspiring actress Laura Babcock. By the time arrests were made in connection with Tim's murder, Laura was already missing for about a year. She had met Delan at a pub in Toronto. They dated for no more than a month, after which they remained friends, although romantic encounters still occurred. In 2010, Laura met Sean Lerner. Sean was a complete opposite of Delan, and he was clearly in love with Laura. Although their relationship ended after 18 months, they remained friends. After graduating from college, Laura had difficulty getting her life together. She was depressed, had arguments with her parents over their house rules, and found herself practically homeless, staying with friends. To make ends meet, Laura turned to the escort industry. Upon learning about her friend's difficulties, Sean paid for a motel room where Laura could stay with her pet and provided her with an iPad to search for more conventional work. It was Sean Lerner who organized a party for Laura's 22nd birthday, inviting Delan and his future girlfriend, Christina Nuga, among others. Clearly, it was this love triangle that led to the tragedy. Laura continued seeing Delan behind Christina's back, but Christina likely suspected something, and on Laura's 23rd birthday, she sent her a message saying, "Happy birthday." It has been exactly a year since Delan and I became intimate. Laura immediately retaliated, saying, "Great, and I was with him 2 weeks ago." This message genuinely upset Christina about her boyfriend's infidelity. Delan had to assure her that he would deal with Laura, promising Christina, "First, I'll hurt her. Then I'll make her leave. I'll remove her from our lives." On July 3, 2012, Laura went home to her parents and left her dog, suitcase with belongings, and a shoebox containing approximately $1,000 in cash. She then went to the subway station, where Delan picked her up and drove her to his home. At 7:03, Laura made a call to check her voicemail, and her phone connected to a tower near Delan's home. After that, her phone stopped working completely. At 7:30, Delan informed Mark that he was on a mission and would return in an hour. The next day, Laura's iPad was connected to Delan's computer, and its name was changed to Mark's iPad. Afterward, Delan took a picture of an object wrapped in blue tarp. In light of the events that unfolded, the photo speaks for itself. Delan asked a worker from his aviation company to build a massive furnace for him, but when that experiment failed, he ordered a waste incinerator. On July 23rd, he sent a message to Mark stating that the barbecue was hot and ready for meat. Delan's internet search history during that time revealed his interest in the effective temperature for cremation. Finally, he took a photo of Mark with the pipe from the incinerator and filmed the flames erupting from it. On July 14th, Laura's family and Sean Lerner reported her disappearance to the police, but upon learning about her recent mental state and profession, the officers didn't pursue her case, assuming she would return on her own. However, Sean refused to let the matter rest. He obtained a printout of Laura's recent calls and conducted his own investigation. It didn't take him long to discover that the last 8 calls from her phone were made to Delan Millard. Sean called Delan, who initially ignored the calls but eventually agreed to meet him and discuss the situation. Delan claimed that Laura had asked him for illicit substances but didn't receive them. He then told Sean not to hope to see her again. Sean relayed all the information he had gathered to the police, presenting them with Delan Millard's name on a silver platter. However, the detectives once again refused to take any action. Laura's case was forgotten, but a year later, when Sean heard about Delan's arrest for murder, he quickly connected the dots and convinced Laura's family to call the Hamilton police. Unlike their counterparts in Toronto, the Hamilton officers showed great interest in their story. After the arrest of the men, Laura's iPad and her sports bag with her name and address written by her hand were found at Mark's house. In addition to incriminating photos on the iPad, investigators found a video in which Mark raps and essentially confesses to burning the girl's body and throwing her phone into the river.
Outside the home, and if you go swimming, you can find the phone.
Laura was still considered missing in November 2012 when the Toronto police missed 2 crucial leads. They were of a slightly different nature, but equally important to the case. An online advertisement for a motorcycle appeared, and just a few days later, its owner, Marty McDougall, came home to find that both the motorcycle and its trailer were gone. He knew that there was a surveillance camera right across the road that could help identify the thieves. Marty contacted the police, and an officer came and took the camera footage. However, despite Marty's persistent attempts to reach the investigator, he heard nothing from the police. It wasn't until several months later, after Tim's murder, that the Hamilton police contacted Marty, having discovered the stripped motorcycle and trailer. Where were they? In Millard's aviation hangar. This raises the question of why the police didn't use the footage to track Millard months earlier and save Tim. The third crucial lead that the police missed was the sudden demise of Wayne Millard, Delan's father. After speaking with family members and colleagues, the police discovered that Wayne had threatened to cut off the funding for his son's extravagant lifestyle. Delan was spending enormous sums of money and showed little interest in the family business. Wayne didn't want his son to destroy the fruits of his family's hard work and was planning to put an end to it, but he didn't get the chance. Wayne was found in his bedroom, deceased. He had suffered a gunshot wound to the head, and a revolver was found nearby. Initially, the case seemed obvious to the police. However, now that the detectives knew about Delan, they wanted to re-examine the facts. At that time, He was not considered a suspect, although it's unclear why investigators didn't pay closer attention to his behavior. He appeared too calm, relaxed, and gave very strange answers to questions. However, when a relative passes away and someone needs to identify the body, if someone asked when was the last time they saw that person, nobody would answer, 5 minutes ago, to the coroner. No, a person would recall the last time they saw their relative alive. The reason for this is that most people don't want to think about death. When answering such a question, the brain automatically goes back to a previous, more positive moment. But the problem with Delan is that the murder brought him pleasure, so when asked about the last time he saw Wayne, he immediately thought about the body. One more important detail: Wayne was cremated, but his hands were tested for gunshot residue, and none was found. In combination with the odd behavior of the millionaire's son and the apparent financial benefit for the heir, it's strange that the police quickly closed the case. As for the family's friends and journalists, they were informed that the man died from a brain aneurysm. Since they didn't know the true cause of his death, no one suspected anything. Otherwise, they would likely have demanded a thorough investigation. When the detectives finally took up the case after Delan and Mark's arrest, it wasn't difficult for them to discover that the revolver from which the bullet was fired had been purchased by Delan prior to Laura Babcock's disappearance, and his DNA was found on it. Initially, Delan claimed that he stayed at Mark's house before returning home around 6 p.m. and finding his father. However, phone records showed that he was at home from 1 a.m. to 6 a.m., precisely during Wayne's time of death. It's as if the accumulating evidence against the two was not enough. Delan secretly passed 65 letters to Christine from prison, instructing her on what statements she should give. He ordered her to destroy all the letters immediately after reading them, but she did not comply. During the trial, Delan and Mark almost confessed to the murder, shifting blame onto each other. However, in this case, it didn't matter who pulled the trigger. Both accomplices were found guilty of the murders of Tim and Laura and were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Delan received a similar punishment for his father's murder. The judge ruled that they would serve their sentences consecutively, meaning Delan would have to spend 75 years in prison before he could even be eligible for parole. This is the maximum sentence ever imposed in the history of Ontario. Delan's girlfriend, Christina Nuga, pleaded guilty to obstructing justice in relation to Tim's death. She revealed that she transported a car trailer and an incinerator to dispose of the evidence. The 24-year-old received a lenient punishment due to her testimony against Delan and spent 3 months in prison. She later moved to Poland, where she attended medical school. The remains of Laura and Tim were never identified, but it is highly likely that they were found in the incinerator. Delan Millard grew up in an affluent family and could have had everything he wanted. However, it turned out that what he wanted was to become a criminal. Just 2 years after meeting Mark, they started going on what they called night missions, stealing cars and motorcycles, not for profit, but for the thrill of it. They often burned them on the side of the road or destroyed them in an aircraft hangar. Once considered one of Canada's most eligible bachelors, he officially transformed into a serial killer, accused of murdering his father, former girlfriend, and an unknown person in less than a year. But if Laura and his father stood in Delan's way, we will probably never know why he killed Tim. Whether out of boredom, audacity, or growing confidence that he could get away with anything, even murder. In July 2019, an unprecedented scandal erupted in Romania, demonstrating how the police respond to calls to the emergency service. The call to number 112 was received on July 25th at 11:05. The caller, a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Alexandra Masisanu, struggling to speak, told the operator that she had been kidnapped, beaten, assaulted, and was being held against her will in some house.
Alo?
Bună ziua!
Bună ziua!
Vreau și în legătură cu poliția.
Da. Ce s-a întâmplat?
Doamnă,
Nu vă numiți.
sunt domnișoara, am 15 ani și ieri am fost sequestrată de către un domn.
Cum te cheamă?
She didn't know where she was, but only knew that she was in the city of Caracal. Before the call was interrupted, the operator sarcastically asked how they would find her if she didn't tell them her location.
Mă ziceam, Alexandra, vă rog, veniți repede, nu știu unde sunt.
Cum adică nu știi unde ești? În ce localitate te afli?
În Caracal, m-a dus în Caracal, dar nu știu unde exact.
Păi dă-mi un punct de reper unde te afli în Caracal. Cum crezi că te găsim?
Fortunately, Alexandra called again at 11:06, and the operator once again tried to ascertain her location. The girl managed to provide important details. For example, she had seen a dam before the kidnapper blindfolded her eyes. He had a gray car, and she was being held in a very old, dilapidated house near a gas station. There was a lot of grass and bushes in the yard, as well as 2 dogs. She even mentioned a name and an address that she read from a business card she found, and explained that she was calling from the kidnapper's phone. The operator relayed the situation to a police officer who continued to communicate with the girl. He told her to stay where she was because they were sending a team. Alexandra tried to provide more description of the kidnapper's car in the yard, but the police officer wasn't listening anymore. The schoolgirl called again at 11:12 and asked if they had sent anyone to help her. Another police officer replied irritably that the team had already been dispatched but couldn't reach her in 2 minutes. Alexandra begged the police officer to stay on the line with her because she was terrified, but he responded that they had other calls to attend to. "The team will arrive in 2 or 3 minutes, what the hell?" he added. The girl reluctantly agreed. Although the emergency services personnel knew that the kidnapper was supposed to return any minute, they inexplicably called Alexandra 9 more times, but no one answered. Not surprisingly, even if the girl had initially tried to discreetly place the phone back, the kidnapper now knew for certain that she had called the police. 12 hours after Alexandra's call, the police finally brought her father to the station, allowed him to listen to the emergency call, and asked if he recognized his daughter's voice. When the man confirmed that it was her voice, they believed it was not a prank, and only then did they begin their investigation. Unfortunately, the name on the business card Alexandra found belonged to a man who had no connection to the case, and the specialized telecommunications service couldn't trace the origin of the call. Technicians were able to provide the officers with a very wide search radius and 3 possible locations for the girl, but none of the specified locations were correct. At that point, the police turned to surveillance camera recordings to identify a vehicle involved in a similar case. Once they identified the driver, they surrounded his house. Despite not being legally required, the police applied for a warrant and simply waited. They received the warrant at 6 in the morning on July 26th, a staggering 19 hours after Alexandra's call. Only then did they knock on the suspect's house gate. Of course, they were late. Inside the house, they found Alexandra's clothes and jewelry in the car, the girl's earring, and in the yard, a metallic barrel with ashes and human remains. The man stated that he doesn't know any Alexandru Mashishano, and the ashes in the barrel remained after the fire he lit to defend himself from persistent mosquitoes. However, after a thorough examination of the barrel's contents, investigators found 6 teeth. The results of the laboratory analysis left no room for doubt. The teeth belonged to Alexandra. The police arrested the homeowner, 66-year-old Gerga Dinka, a retired mechanic. Neighbors knew Georga as an aggressive and inhumane person. So inhumane that he had a special code for his rare visitors. 3 knocks on the door. He suffered from antisocial personality disorder, had been admitted to a mental institution 5 times, and his troubled childhood could have been a possible reason for his condition. Georga's father worked as a butcher, engaging in illegal meat trade, often killing and butchering animals in front of his son, forcing the boy to assist. This soon became routine, and Georga himself was already killing stray animals for his twisted pleasure. His father was a heavy drinker and frequently beat the boy, using belts, brooms, and even the hose from the washing machine multiple times a day. He also tied his son up with a wire to prevent him from going outside to play with other kids. Interestingly, later on, Georga started treating his own victims the same way. Not surprisingly, the boy performed poorly in school. However, when he joined the army, it seemed like his life was getting on track, and he found his place, until he assaulted another soldier who turned out to be the son of a defense ministry official. Expelled from the army, Georga returned home and got a job as a general laborer at a hospital. He worked there for 8 years before attempting to find work on construction sites in Italy. Once again, things didn't work out. as he was fired after brutally beating an Albanian worker. After attacking a young woman, he was deported from the country. Upon returning to Romania, he worked as a mechanic, drove taxis, and also collected and sold scrap metal. Despite his inhumane behavior and reclusiveness, he managed to start a family and became the father of 4 children. His wife, tired of his constant abuse, lived and worked in Italy. Sources close to Gheorghe say that when his wife came to Romania for the last time, he severely beat her. All 4 children left their father's house. 3 sons chose to live with their mother, while the daughter settled in Timisoara. After George's arrest, she insisted that she had no contact with her father, whom she considered mentally unstable. So, as it appears, Gheorghe Dinka was a recluse, living in isolation, and his behavioral issues couldn't resolve on their own. Another shocking piece of news shocked the public. Gheorghe confessed to the murder of the second girl, whom he abducted in April, 2 months prior to Alexandra's kidnapping. The second victim of the man was an 18-year-old named Luisa Melencu. Until the age of 12, Luisa lived in Italy with her mother, Monica Melencu, who worked there and engaged in vegetable cultivation. However, in search of a better life and income, Monica moved to the United Kingdom, while Luisa chose to finish school in her homeland and lived with her grandparents. She dedicated a lot of time to her studies and was determined to get an excellent education to find a job with a decent salary to support her family. But she relied on her mother's support for the time being. On April 14th, her mother sent her money for sports shoes. Luisa went to an ATM in Caracal, but for some reason, she couldn't withdraw money. She called her grandfather to let him know she was on her way home and headed to the bus stop. However, since it was Sunday and public transportation was scarce, especially in rural areas where locals often complained about its unreliability even on weekdays, Luisa decided to hitchhike. Unfortunately, Gheorghe Dinka was passing by. He agreed to give her a ride. Luisa struck up a conversation and told him about her failed attempt to get money from the ATM. Upon hearing this, Gheorghe offered her 30 lei, approximately $7, for intimate services. She refused, after which Gheorghe decided to take what he wanted by force. Meanwhile, Luisa's grandfather began to worry because he knew his granddaughter should have been home by now. He called her mobile phone, but she didn't answer. Recognizing this behavior as entirely out of character, he rushed to the police station to report her disappearance. However, the officers dismissed his concerns, attributing Luisa's absence to a potential romantic involvement. Left with no choice, Luisa's family started searching for her themselves, and her classmates spread information about her disappearance on social media. The next day, an unidentified man called Luisa's grandfather, assuring him that Luisa was fine but didn't want to talk to him. He added that they were planning to go to Switzerland together. Not believing a word of the stranger's claim, the grandfather made multiple attempts to contact the police but received no assistance. Luisa's mother, Monica, traveled from the UK, where she had been living and working, and had somewhat better luck with the police. Only on the 4th day did the police begin an investigation which seemed more like mockery of the relatives. Luisa's grandfather was subjected to a polygraph test because they suspected him of withholding information. Finally, on May 30th, the case was handed over to the Directorate for Investigating Organized Crime and Terrorism, DICOT, which announced the opening of a criminal case on June 6th. They decided to investigate Luisa's disappearance as a human trafficking case, as they saw signs that she might have been recruited against her will for sexual exploitation. DICOT continued their investigation when news broke about the disappearance of another girl, Alexandra Mashishanu. A 15-year-old teenager from Dobro, Slovenia, was a student in the 10th grade at one of the top schools in Caracal. On July 24th, Alexandra left her home at 10 o'clock in the morning to meet a friend from Caracal. No one else saw her after that. The girl's parents quickly turned to the police, but the officers did not take their concerns seriously, stating that she was old enough to go out with friends and lose track of time. They advised them to wait. When the truth about the 2 murders came to light, the criminal inaction and negligence of officials and law enforcement personnel triggered a massive political crisis in the country. Many government bodies tried to demonstrate their activity, showing that they were doing their job, but it did not help them. The Minister of the Interior, the head of the criminal police, the director of the rescue service, the police leadership, and the prosecution in Caracal were all dismissed. The Prime Minister dismissed the Minister of Education, who cynically remarked that young girls should think twice before getting into strangers' cars, as if she were unaware of the problems with public transportation in the country and the fact that hitchhiking is sometimes the only way to travel in small towns. The police claimed that the Special Telecommunications Service employees could not provide more precise information about the origins of the calls, leading to their search efforts being focused in the wrong places. However, the police were also criticized for their slow and chaotic response. Frustrated, the grandfather of Louisa labeled them as criminals being paid by the government to not do their job. At the same time, questions arose about the remains of the murdered girls. Here is where the most significant mystery of this story begins. Gheorghe stated that he burned the bodies. He scattered fragments of Louisa's bones in the forest and disposed of her clothes. However, he did not have time to do the same with Alexandra's clothes and body. Investigators reconstructed the crime scenes. Gheorghe was asked to guide the investigators step by step to all the places he had been on the days of the deaths of Louisa and Alexandra. At this point, he started to contradict himself in his statements, allegedly struggling to remember what he did at the time. According to criminologists, Gheorghe intentionally led them on a wild goose chase. Although he confessed to the 2 murders he was asked about, when he was requested to repeat his actions during the crimes and show where he left the remains, he panicked. This might be because he probably had a secret location where he hid all his victims. As there were likely more than 2 bodies in that hidden place, he led the investigators on a wild goose chase, pretending to be confused, not understanding and not remembering anything. Although fragments of bones were found in the forest, experts believed that the bodies were either in the Danube or the Olt River. In November 2019, while in prison, Gheorghe began to write a confession detailing what he had done to Louisa and Alexandra. He started his account with the incident on April 14th, when he stopped his car as Louise was hitchhiking on the road. He agreed to give her a ride and engaged in conversation with her during the journey. He realized that he was becoming sexually aroused. His thoughts were consumed by nothing else but fulfilling his own desires. The man offered the girl 30 Romanian lei, about $7, for intimate services. When she declined, he struck her in the face and bound her with a belt. Interestingly, Gheorghe also blindfolded her so that the victim wouldn't know the way to his house. Does this imply that he intended to release her alive? After parking the car at his house, the man noticed his 36-year-old neighbor, Stefan Repeziano, in the yard. Stefan occasionally helped Gheorghe clean up the yard. Seeing a beautiful young girl in the car, Stefan asked who she was. With no other option, Gheorghe said that he brought her for intimate services, and the neighbor asked to join him. Gheorghe agreed. The men subjected Louise to humiliation and continued to torment her for 4 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Gheorghe lost his temper when the girl tried to resist him for the last time. He violently beat her and left her in a pool of blood on the bed, briefly stepping out to feed otters. When he returned, it was already too late to help the girl. The man didn't panic. He placed her in a metallic barrel and set it on fire, covering it with plastic and cardboard. Then, he went to sleep. When he woke up, he collected the ashes and fragments of bones and scattered them along the border of the nearby forest. Gheorghe's account of what happened to Alexandra was even more sinister. On July 24th, 2 months after Louisa's murder, he noticed the same girl hitchhiking on the road again. Even though he was driving in the opposite direction, he turned the car around and offered her a ride. The story repeated itself. He offered Alexandra 50 lei for intimate services, and upon her refusal, he abducted her. He brought the bound girl to his home, immediately tying her to the bed and subjecting her to violence. The next day at 6 in the morning, Gheorghe was drinking coffee while his victim lay tied to the bed. The girl complained of a terrible headache and said she needed a painkiller. Gheorghe suggested going to buy some medication. Before leaving, he additionally tied her with ropes, wires, and a chain. In addition to the medication, he bought a prepaid card to call Alexandra's mother. Inserting it into the girl's mobile phone, he called her mother and claimed to be Alexandra's boyfriend, assuring her that everything was fine. Then he discarded the phone. The phone was later found, and some children played with it. The man returned home around noon. He saw that Alexandra had freed herself and was wandering around the house with his mobile phone. He struck her several times, causing her to fall and hit her head on the concrete floor, resulting in her death. The man wrapped the body in bedsheets, placed some wooden planks and chips, and a 2-liter bottle of Vaseline in a barrel and set it on fire. On top, he threw a thick cardboard. He also threw his mobile phone there. Then he went to sleep. He woke up early in the morning to the barking of dogs, as police were banging on his door. Despite the man's confession and the results of the DNA analysis, the families of Alexandra and Louisa refused to believe that Gheorghe killed the girls. And the matter was not only in the reluctance of the relatives to believe that they are no longer alive. In fact, there was reason to suspect Gheorghe of human trafficking and that the girls weren't killed but were sold for exploitation. First of all, in favor of this version is the fact that human trafficking is a very common phenomenon in Romania. Additionally, in 2022, Gheorghe recanted his confession. He confirmed that he kidnapped and mistreated Alexandra and Louisa, but then handed them over to a local criminal boss who sent the girls to a brothel in Turkey. The police allegedly protect this boss, so they tortured Gheorghe and forced him to take the blame for the murder, and they planted Alexandra's teeth themselves. The man's story seems far-fetched if it weren't for some facts. It's unclear why George didn't immediately try to dispose of Alexandra's body, knowing that she had called the police from his phone. Instead of that, he slowly cremated her body for a long 8 hours. Moreover, the burning of an entire human body should produce a very unpleasant smell and smoke. However, the man's neighbors didn't notice any smoke, smell, or anything unusual. The way Gheorghe behaved during the abductions shows that he knew step by step how to act. He knew how to select victims of a specific appearance, and the act of abduction itself seemed standardized. The series of potential crimes was only interrupted when Alexandra pulled him out of this familiar routine by calling the police. Furthermore, investigators speculated that Gheorghe might have had accomplices. The point is, right after the girls' disappearances, unknown individuals called both families several times, assuring them that the girls were all right. At least 2 of these calls were made by Gheorghe, but Alexandra's mother and Louisa's grandfather are convinced that 2 people were calling them. This argument that Gheorghe might have had accomplices prompted not only Romanian police, but also the FBI, Eurojust, and Italy's main anti-mafia agency to get involved in the investigation. Additionally, it seemed to the relatives that the prosecution intentionally prolonged the case. In particular, the prosecutor received video material that indicated Gheorghe's car was connected to Louisa's abduction, but the prosecutor never summoned him for questioning or ordered a search of his car or home. After Alexandra's disappearance until July 27th, he didn't share the surveillance camera footage, which captured Gheorghe's car. Even then, he only showed them a single frame from the video where the car's license plate wasn't visible. Also, on July 27th, after searching the man's house, another accuser not only claimed that Alexandra was killed on that night, but also that strangulation was the cause of her death. However, how could he know this without the victim's body? Gheorghe hadn't made a confession yet. And finally, the most intriguing argument in favor of the possibility that the man might have been involved in human trafficking is that his daughter, Daniela Dinky, assured investigators and the media that she wanted nothing to do with her father and didn't communicate with him. But it turned out to be a lie. She did communicate with her father, and she has a criminal record herself. A few years ago, she was accused of connections to human trafficking networks. Following this, another revelation came in the story. Gheorghe Dinka's son, Dan, was once involved in a group assault and escaped punishment only due to his father's intervention. Allegedly, Gheorghe had connections within the police and the prosecutor's office. The victim was persuaded to withdraw her statement and the case was kept confidential. Equally important in this case is the question of whether Gheorghe's list of victims could be longer. 2 girls were abducted under similar circumstances when trying to hitchhike, and they resembled each other in appearance. This points to a characteristic modus operandi of the criminal, relying on chance and showing an interest in a specific type of appearance. The man's inclination to commit crimes might partly be explained by his suffering from antisocial personality disorder. This condition is characterized by a constant pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction, as well as a lack of empathy, respect for the feelings, needs, or suffering of others, and a lack of remorse after offending or causing harm to another person. Some individuals suffering from this condition cannot form close relationships and use dominance and intimidation to control others. In this context, all the elements of the puzzle come together to form a coherent picture.
But what's surprising is Gheorghe's age, 66 years old. Criminals with a similar diagnosis usually evolve into violent killers during their youth. This disorder remains with a person throughout their life and doesn't appear and then diminish like other mental disorders. In other words, it's rare for a man to suddenly kill 2 girls with a 2-month gap at the age of 66.
Gheorghe most likely committed other heinous crimes in the past. It's unlikely that Alexandra and Louise were his only victims. Very unlikely. Gheorghe was charged with human trafficking, trafficking of minors, 2 cases of assault, 2 murders, and 2 cases of desecration of bodies. But he wasn't planning on surrendering so easily. Dubbed the Caracal monster, he attempted to sue Romania in the European Court of Human Rights, pointing to a lack of evidence and claiming that he was treated unfairly during his arrest. He fought for a long time, but ultimately lost. On September 23rd, the 69-year-old Gheorghe was sentenced to the maximum possible punishment, 30 years of imprisonment. The thing is, for all the charges brought against him, he should have received 108 years in prison. But for individuals over the age of 65, the maximum punishment is considered to be 30 years. He is also obligated to pay compensation of 700,000 euros to the victim's relatives. The neighbor of the man, Stefan Repeziano, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his involvement in the violence. In March 2023, Gheorghe once again caught the public's attention by declaring that he had repented and found God. He stated that he was able to forget and leave behind the entire ordeal. In contrast to him, the victim's relatives will never be able to forget what happened.